Welcome to the third day and the last day of the MORTEXVAR conference. We are going to have today our main topic is tracers. So these elements of variability in the mainstream that allow us to trace change, innovation, or disparity processes, including errors and corrections. To that end, we have a panel of speakers today. And the session today is going to be chaired by Andreas Stauder from the École Pratique des Études in Paris. And Andreas, I leave you the floor.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for the kind invitation to chair this session, what promises to be a very interesting and lively afternoon. So I propose we start right away with Jorge Grottenhuis from University of California, Berkeley, and Israel Academy of Sciences, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, on a very data-rich and complex topic, namely variation in the graphical form of the first-person stative ending in the coffin text. Please, Jorge.
Thank you so much. Let's see, I hope everything is working. So good morning, good afternoon, and good night to anybody listening here, because I'm afraid that it's going to be the point here. Today, as stated by Andreas, I will be talking about the appearance of the first-person stative ending for the singular in the coffin text. And yes, to get into it, sorry, it's rather early morning for me, so I might ramble a bit more than I'm used to. So my main topic today will be focused on the diatopic axis of variation, so regional-based variations. And this stems mostly from my personal interest into dialect. Now, the problem with dialect, way too shortly put today, is that it's nearly impossible to prove dialect in ancient Egyptian writings. However, it is obviously, it was there. So there have been some examples in Egyptian texts that I don't have the time to quote here, but there are some signs that the Egyptians understood it as well. But thanks to the fact that dialect is always talked about in more of the vowel system than anything else, it really restricts our options in our work, because we only have semi-vowels at best, and it's already shown in multiple phonological studies that the exact nature of those vowels are not that clear. So therefore, I'm actually arguing to some extent that we might, for Egyptology, need to extend the whole idea of what dialect is, or at least regional variation, to be on the safe side of things, that it might be necessary to stress the definition of it. So I would argue, I'm not certain if I can do that completely coherently and completely without fault, but I would argue that it might be worthwhile to extend the idea of dialect to the writing system itself. So in this case, how signs, which signs are used, which spellings are used, and how they appear on a page, because I believe personally, at least, that there might be some actions there that are not truly dialectal, but rather an effect of teaching and picking up as a student, sending it on to the next generation, which might eventually create a local tradition. So as I said, so there's no real variation possible or visible on the phonetic level, so therefore it's worthwhile to look at this. However, what I also find important to stress here is that it might also be valuable to make sure that we take in the true nature of the hieroglyphic language, that's a two-dimensional language. So instead of only consisting of signs on a line, it always has multiple directions to it, and it's also worthwhile to keep that in mind. So to give you an example here, where I actually make a distinction between spelling and graphical form. And this might feel a bit unnatural for Egyptologists, but I think it's worthwhile to at least take this into regard to make sure that we can keep variation as important in our view as possible. So in the case of Sechem, which exists of 3 signs, in this case, both of the 2 examples I show here will of course have the same spelling, because it's the same sequence of signs. However, if you compare them as written in a column, in this case, they are not the same anymore, because in one case there are 3 signs on a line within a column. The other one is two signs on a line followed by a third later. And as people have preferences in writing style, I think this might, and I have to stress might, show some importance. Additionally, here I want to add something that I did not put on the slide, but I want to make sure that it's understood that I have 2 definitions that I use as well during this talk. The one is witness and the other one is support. The distinction here is quite necessary in coven text, because we are dealing with, when you have spells, there are often cases that there are the same spell occurs twice on the same object. So therefore, a support I would refer, is the reference to the entire object. So it's a coffin, a tomb chamber, or something like that, with one caveat for T1C, which technically has 2 supports because you have the coffin and the tomb chamber itself. And if I'm talking about witness, I'm talking about a single attestation of a spell in the coffin. So it's possible for support to have multiple witnesses, but never the reverse. So for the first person singular stative or all perfective or any of the other formats that people use to describe this thing, I have to say that I don't put the entire list of the bibliographical background on this, so I'm not going to go into detail what it exactly is. But one of the main reasons I've chosen this one as a main subject of study is partly because I've already discussed this in a smaller format in my own dissertation. It's also because it's one of those cases where this morpheme is extremely varied, and that's actually what makes it much more interesting to work with. So if you go through the third person, basically there's or nothing written, or it's only a T or an U if you're lucky, but therefore you have much more option to look at because there's much more variation going on. So for the first person stative ending, I subscribe to the idea that there are 4 distinct endings. If you go to Reinke's, he is actually suggesting 5, but I consider the 5th of Reinke's simply an erroneous writing for what I consider the 4th writing, that's Kui. So we deal with the 4 main types of Kei, Ki, Ku, and Kui. Now, I have to really specify here that I follow Camazel completely, that the phonetics after the radical K should not be taken as exactly U and the I at all. This is more a representation of, this is a radical followed by some type of vowel, but we cannot really distinguish which vowel it is. And in this case, the I in my representation of the 4 types is more a representation of that there's some type of classifier going on after in the morpheme, rather than that it's a true phonetic holder of that case. I can't say if that there was no Kui ever spoken in ancient Egypt or vice versa, but I found at least that it's better to consider these cases classifiers than actual phonetic features of the sign. So basically, I have had to reduce the corpus a bit because originally in my own thesis, I did the same type of research, but only based on the material I encoded at the time, which is only a small section of the entire set of coffin texts. And this time I wanted to be a bit more thorough, but obviously I'm still bound by availability of materials. So I reduced it to the publication of the book himself, to the pyramid text publication of Allen, and coffin M1BE, to which I had access thanks to Tobias Conrad from Mainz, and S8X from the publication of Lab, which has also the entire coffin in facsimile and in the full original script, which was also usable in that case. Note that I primarily relied on the concordance of Van der Molen and the like to actually locate all the first-person statives. So it might there's a reasonable chance that I missed some, or that I disagreed with their reading or something in that regard. So In total, from the corpus I have selected, there were 1,616 attestations. Now, I have been in contact with Professor Schenkel, that basically told me that he had about 1,613 cases of the first person stative, if I'm correct. And at that point, I considered that I was close enough that there's no need to worry too much about the numbers exactly, because hey, if I was 15 to 20 off, I really had to recheck my work. But in this case, I was so close to his number that I think that I'm more or less on the same level, and that I did not miss too many of them that might completely ruin what I'm talking about today. Because that's often the case, that you find a single attestation that completely ruins your point. So as you can see here is that the type key and type QI have the most attestations, and the K and Q are a lot lower, but all of them are relatively broadly attested. And here I'm not even gonna completely speak this out, but to give you an idea of where this material comes from. And here I do need to stress very strongly that the majority of the attestations come from Darrell Bersha, because the coffin texts are completely and utterly overrepresented in Darrell Bersha and not in the other locations. So there are cases where any argument for any regional preference in material cannot really be made, because we're actually dealing with way too little material. So it's, for example, in this case, Abydos and Dendera, those two should actually be discarded from the list, because Dendera represents one coffin, and Abydos is also one coffin, but it has a slight additional feature that for all these cases, I have reconstructed it completely. So there's no meaningful data there whatsoever, because it's simply made by myself. So I have to say that I always do my best to make sure that reconstructions are based as closely on the versions that the rest of the visible text reflects the closest. So I always make sure that my reconstructions are based on their most close kin. So for example, if you have the coffin B7C, that one has the rather distinct feature where it uses the A50, so this man seated on a chair for the first person pronoun, and therefore I could relatively confidently reconstruct most of the texts based on B1P, B2P, B1C, and B1L, because those share the same feature, and therefore I was rather secure in my reconstruction, but it does not mean it's true. Additionally, there's another feature that does need to be mentioned here, is that there are quite a few of the large coffin text reports that are not in this data, simply because the personal texts, so the ones that will occur in the first person, are actually written in the third person. So for example, B2BO, B3BO, B4BO, B3C, B4C, and quite a few others of those types replaced the first person in those personal spells with the third person using the name of the owner. But it also means that it grammatically is completely shifted to the third person as well. So those are all out of the consideration, because of course no first person stative is shown. Now, just to be completely honest, beforehand already, I will talk about this later again, I did make sure that I took as many potential factors of variation into regards, although that was less useful than I would have liked, but I want to make sure that I cover my bases. So I have made sure that I kept knowledge of the date, the provenance, gender of the owner, the type of support, so it's the coffin, it's the papyrus, it's the tomb, or whatever. The syntax itself, so in what context is the stative used? So is it U stative, or is it UE stative? Yes, I do make a distinction between those two. Then the location in the support itself, so is it on the back, is the front, or is it on the head, feet, or the bottom, or that kind of type option. Then the location in the column, because there might be cases, so that when it's at the end of a column, that the writing becomes cramped. So therefore, I want to make sure that I took care of it as well. That was noted down. What type of script is used? This is one of those things that's easily can be easily skipped over when you're dealing with the coffin text, but that's because it varies in what type of cursive it's used, which might rather influence how things are actually written. So therefore, I consider that as an important thing to keep in mind as well. So in general, graphics space available for inscription. So this is not just purely at the end of columns, but also in general, how much space was there for the text at all. So certain sections that are spelled, especially if you look at G1T, so the coffin from Turin, there's a lot of places where the spells are written rather cramped together. And that might actually influence, of course, how things are written. And the writing style of the scribe itself. So this is where the graphic form comes in, Morty, because you do notice over time that the scribes that work on these coffins did have a preference for what I usually call long formats or short formats. So do you make a compact writing of any structure? So if you can put two signs next to each other, do you do it? Or do you try to keep it long so that even if it's a thin, tall sign, that you put nothing next to it in the column, but you only do it sequentially beyond there. There is some slight patterns in there, but it's not too much to talk about, sadly. But I did want to make sure that I include it. Obviously, I will have missed angles of variation, but I thought at least that I was covered mostly by at least make sure that I collected these. Well, these have been collected in a rather extensive Excel file that I was not able, of course, that cannot be put in the main text itself because, well, 1616 lines will be a bit much. But I have had discussed this with Carlos that this should become online on the MORTEXVAR sites, together with the publication. So this data will be freely available. A small point I do want to make here for considering my translations. I have a rather tendency to consider every bit of text in the coffin text as correct. So I very strongly limit how much additions I make to it. And this can go rather extreme. So there are cases where adding the first person pronoun behind something is rather obvious, and if it's grammatically possible to translate a phrase as is, I do so. The better case to make for this, for example, in certain spells, you have the statement, I will not eat excrements. And in certain witnesses, the negative N is not there. So in that case, it would be, I will eat excrement. Obviously, I know that this is not what should be there in the text. However, I still keep it as is, just to make sure that I don't accidentally remove the variation by simply thinking that I know better, because it might be intentional and I cannot say for certain. So therefore, it's kept format. So, well, for how the forms actually look, well, for K, there's only two options basically, because the other methods of writing the K is not that popular yet in the Middle Kingdom. For Key, it's already a lot more, as you can see here. There are 19 different forms. Then Ku only has 4. Same issue. That's option. And of course, with Kui, it gets to 30 forms that I was able to locate. And it's a rather large list after a while. So, as my focus was primarily originally on the region, I did actually sort it by type distribution by region, and to give you here an idea of how the material is distributed. So in most cases, all 4 forms were tested, but you can already see rather clear differences in the file here itself, which once again, Abydos and Dendra should be discounted as not saying that much. But you will see that Asyut has a very large section of red, which means that there's primarily type 2 key. And in most of the other regions, it's more of a preference towards Kui. Well, now I will just go from northern attestation to southern attestation through here with the main things that I've located in this material. Now I have to also state here that I did look through this material manually. So there might be additional features that could be pulled out of my data if you do it digitally, but I did not take the time yet to do something like that. But this was based on just a manual look to see what happens over material, just coffin by coffin to see what kind of patterns show up. And there was, sadly, and this is for the reason I'm sometimes a bit worried about this work, is that there was very little to work with, sadly, in most cases. However, in Saqqara, the two primary forms that are tested is type QI or K. And it's very specific there that the humanoid classifier does not show up. So it's always a replacement classifier consisting of the read leaf or read leaf to stroke or only the stroke. Or as you can see with the higher use of the K type, it does not really occur. They will really evade the humanoid figure if that's possible. That does not mean that the humanoid figure does not show up in the text at all. It means that at least for these endings, they seem to evade. In our list, we're deal with type QI and Q mostly. Of course, the other two do occur, but they're a lot rarer. They have in the paired coffins of L1 Li and L2 Li, you have the very distinct use of the mutilated bird. However, this is purely based on the bug because I'm looking forward to Harker Williams' publications on these two coffins for more detail. And considering that these two coffins are a little bit later and seemingly out of the normal sync with the rest of the material, it might actually represent other features than I would have liked to see. And otherwise, you automatically locked the same issue that you have no humanoid figures again, which is rather obvious if the birds are also mutilated in text. That if you're going to mutilate the birds, then you can assume that the humanoids are not going to be there. In Beni Hassan, it's actually the first place where QI is actually barely attested. It's mostly K and Ki. And once again, we're dealing with a set of where the humanoid figure is rather evaded if they could. But in general, the classifiers are a lot lower in attestations. Beni Hassan is one of the highest levels of type K in comparison. However, we're still dealing with Beni Hassan with not that many supports, not that many attestations, so this might look a bit more deceptive than it should be. Then for the Auberger, our main slice of material. Here it was very clear that QI is the most popular form. However, we're dealing once again here with a very deceptive set of data because we have two rather clear, distinct periods of coffin decoration in Der Albertia. So you have the very late 11th dynasty to early 12th dynasty, and the Sesostris the second to Sesostris the third period of coffin decoration. And the first period of coffin decoration, which is, by the way, also very lovely to look at in a way, because it has a very distinct feature where it draws the hieroglyph. Cursive hieroglyphs in the text first and then carves them out partly. So they're a very distinct combination of in comparison to the rest of the material. But one of the main problems with that is that the earlier texts are mostly in the third person rather than first person. So from the earlier set, it's basically only B1, BO, which shows the first person, where the rest always shows the third person. So the material is not only skewed towards the Aubergia, it's also skewed to the later period of decoration. But in general, the cases where there's no classifier whatsoever is the lowest of the attestations in the Aubergia, and QI is clearly the most preferred form to use, with more than 60% of the attestations having some form of QI. As stated before, you have the A50 as a very distinct feature of these coffins when it's used in the first person. And basically, because all the scripts that I use primarily are closer to so Fisher 3B to almost Fisher type 4, i.e. hieratic, there's a clear preference of using V31A over V31. So the basket with the handle towards the front, which is rather logical if you consider the type of text that's used. And there's a clear preference that some type of classifier needs to be used. There is no real pattern on what it is, because even with the witnesses that use A50 for the first person, there's still a lot of cases where it's simply the seated man. But there's always some classifier, and it is in the great majority of it, it is with some type of humanoid classifier. Then with MER, the same thing as Delbertia, it's primarily CUI. And what is very intriguing about the MER coffins is it's one of the most individualistic in types of what they use. So basically, they are very consistent within the coffin itself, but nearly every coffin has their own format that they prefer to use. So however they spell it, it's always a very unique format. And it runs the gamut from non-humanoid classifier to full humanoid classifier. And there's one coffin in MER as well, which uses the seated god actually for the first person as well. So that's actually also another annoying feature the first time you hit that coffin. But there's always some type, nearly always some type of classifier used. Then for Asiut, that's actually where the intriguing part, in my opinion, really starts. The fact that it's primarily key. However, caveat here is that we're dealing with most of the material coming from S1C and S2C, which are part of the same assemblage. So might resemble more a case of material that reflects simply one set of coffins rather than anything else. However, there is a few cases of CUI, to my utter annoyance, to be honest, because when I was doing my dissertation, my material showed only key and no CUI whatsoever. However, there is some caveats to the use of CUI. In S10C, it only occurs in one spell, which is currently in the book only attested in S1C, S10C, and the rest comes from S8. And that is a coffin that is a bit unusual, and that's saying something when you're dealing with Asiut coffins, but it is even for Asiut coffins a bit out of order. And if I want to go way too far in my assumptions here, and I have to say way too far, I might even argue that it could be argued that maybe this coffin isn't even from Asiut, but that is going way too far. The Theban area, it's same as the Delbertia and MER. It's mostly type CUI, but there's a large section of type K as well. Although those are only tested from two specific supports, so it seems more a personal feature of the support than anything else. But however, there is a clear preference for humanoid classifier here. And then Gabriel and Aswan, these one I grouped together, partly because they have the issue that we're dealing here with two witnesses from Gameline, same assemblage, and one witness from Asiut. However, as stated before by Deschamps and by Harker Willems, these seem to represent a southern school of coffin decoration in the first intermediate period and should probably be considered together. So that's what I did. Actually, the fun part here is that they still, on the first person stative, do rather diverge from each other. So by G1T and G2T as either key or CUI, and very specifically, it's always the reed leaf seated man as classifier. None other classifiers ever used, and usually it's written rather compact. And in A1C, however, it's mostly CUI or K, and there it's only the seated man. So there is some distinction between the two here. However, because we're dealing here with basically singular sets, you can't really say anything about it. This represents something of the south or whatever. And finally, because they cannot officially be bound to regions, we have the papyri and Y1C, which are fully or nearly fully used the type key. And I'm not the first one to argue this. This has been argued on other reasons as well, but I find it very drastic that this follows the same system as Asiut, mostly, where the primarily form is key. And this is, for me, is just another point that can be made that, yeah, this material is most likely from Asiut specifically. So now to come to the point where I got most annoyed by is that, yes, I did all the effort to try to find other types of variations and make sure that I take note of all the optional variations. Basically, there's none of the other factors I looked at seems to leverage any type of pattern that is meaningful and or can be stated. So I might have missed it but because I did this manually, but I could not locate anything of value in any of the other factors, which means that at least for this a very specific small subsection of discussion of variation, there is no reason to look into these features, in my opinion, sadly. There are some support-specific features that were interesting and noteworthy. So, for example, in T1C, on the head of the tomb, for some reason, there is primarily the type K, specifically with V31, although there are some other options there as well. But it was the main form that, for some reason, orientation stayed more or less the same there. And basically, there were a few cases where I could actually show, yeah, the look of the group at the end changed because the end of the column came in a few RCUT covenant that they cut off the form to make it short to the K type. But there's only in 4 of the covenants, and all the other covenants don't do that when it's at the end. So it's completely accidental rather than any real pattern. But it was, I was happily surprised at least some cases where you can more or less show, yeah, this is intentional because, well, there was no more space. So to sum up for my main conclusion, there is some evidence for some regional preference. I cannot call to the tradition whatsoever, but there's some regional preferences in how the morphine of the first person stated is actually written out. In the northernmost attestations of the covenant texts, or at least the material I had access to, there seems to be a real tendency to avoid the human right classifier. I can't give you any reason why, obviously, but it was noteworthy to see there. Daryl Bersha and Mayer have a clear preference for the use of CUI, which, if there is some phonetic feature to it, might reflect a dialectal feature, but this is conjecture upon conjecture upon conjecture upon conjecture. And Asyut seems to have a clear preference for type key. I would thank you for your attention, and I have to, of course, mention that this talk has been made possible partly in funding awarded to Deborah Anderson in UC Berkeley, and Elise Meyer research grant awarded to Professor Jean Minan of the University of Liège. And I hope you're still awake.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorge, for this methodologically very considerate paper, which also points to an issue of general importance, namely that we always have this dialectics between written and underlying forms, and that certain of the concepts that we use have to be defined as encompassing both, but explicitly as you did. So that will certainly have relevance for the methodological discussion. Afterwards, without further delay, we move on to the next paper. I should just say, please keep in time. We have a little more time because James Allen cannot be with us, but now we should try to stay in time. So we begin this alternation with material culture papers that will define the afternoon with Gersand, Eschenbrenner, and Diemer, Universidad de Alcalá, reconnecting artifacts and thinking in the afterlife, the case of funerary wooden models.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Is it working? Yeah. Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you very much for Carlos for welcoming me in this conference, and I'm very happy to be with all of you today. And since these 2 days we are all together, so I think that at the end we will have a lot of things to say, and I will try to stay on time. I promise you that. So to start with the funerary wooden models, I will just make a few recap about what is this type of object, and we'll give you some conclusion of the comprehensive study I did on this material. So funerary wooden models emerged in the funerary equipment of the Egyptian elites during the Dynasty 6 and disappeared completely during the reign of Sesostri III in Dynasty 12. Long considered as sympathetic but insignificant, this object actually occupied a central place in religious thought between the end of the Old Kingdom and the second half of the Middle Kingdom. Thus, their production and the themes treated are closely linked to the evolution of funerary thought during this key period of Egyptian history. Moreover, the wooden funerary models embody the new concepts related to the deceased and his status in the afterlife, themes that are the heart of the contemporary funerary literature. Wooden funerary models are not an ex nihilo creation of the late Old Kingdom. These wooden scenes deposited in tombs of the Egyptian elites are part of the continuity of funerary practices initiated in the first dynasty, first in the royal sphere and then among the elite, for whom a supplied and protected rebirth was essential. It is from these needs that the principle of the funerary servant place in the tomb developed, its appearance and the material used for its construction having evolved over time. Indeed, while the practice persists, the profane nature of these objects evolves with the transformation in religious thought. This is especially true when we talk about wooden funerary models, often called models or miniature. Before we look specifically at how wooden funerary models are closely related to funerary text, it is important to define the concept of a wooden funerary model. First of all, regarding the comprehensive study that I was able to carry out of the corpus of the wooden models, the latter, which are never named in text or even represented in the parietal scenes that show the transport of offerings, should not be considered as material goods, but as supports of the necessary to feed, move, clothe themselves, supply themselves with livestock and food, and gradually be reborn like Osiris. However, according to a generally accepted definition, a wooden funerary model is considered to be a substitute of an object, as are other forms of models. Wooden funerary models are also classified by Sally Swain in this category, which also includes boats and pottery, a category that she distinguishes from the funerary servants. However, it is essential to distinguish an object model from a funerary model. To this end, let us take the example of the boat models without crew members that appeared in the pre-dynastic period and that must be distinguished from wooden funerary model of boats. These models of boats are made of clay, wood, or stone and deposited in burial sites of individuals as early as the pre-dynastic period. Regarding the studies of Altenmüller and Werner, they would correspond to the representation of the boat used during the day and one used at night. Therefore, a distinction must be made between the substitute boat and a funerary model of a boat. The first, without a crew, is charged with a strong religious symbolism, whether it is a scale model or a full-size boat. It symbolizes the journey of the deceased to the afterlife. On the other hand, contrary to what is generally accepted, the funerary model of a boat has several functions. Firstly, it corresponds to the means of transport materialized by two boats, a sailing boat and a rowing boat, to allow the deceased to move in the afterlife. Deceased can be represented on these boats, but as we will see then, this representation should be related to the notion of living, active person rather than a deceased one. It is precisely the symbolism of the deceased that has undergone a clear evolution with the development of wooden funerary models, closely connecting text and materiality. Ultimately, an empty boat, whether miniature or life-size, is a substitute object in the same way as votive dishes used since Dynasty IV. Susan Allen gives a particularly interesting definition of these miniature dishes as a sort of three-dimensional virtual reality, magically effective in the present and for eternity. This definition clearly illustrates the functional parallel between the category of funerary models and that of substitute objects. The nuance lies in the presence or absence of active figurines. Indeed, the principle of three-dimensional virtual reality applies to the funerary models, but its active character distinguishes it from substitute objects, such as empty boats and miniature dishes. More than a system of thoughts, it is their effective nature that seems to be at the origin of the development and the diffusion of wooden funerary models. These objects, at least until the first half of the reign of Sesostris I, have the function of materializing the needs of the deceased for his rebirth. They are their supports that remain hidden from any spectator. They accompany the image of the deceased embodied by the statue into the funerary chamber. Indeed, If close links unite the funerary models and the formulas of the coffin text on numerous occasions, whether it be the representation of the comorous, the provisioning of the deceased through the image of the goddess Sechet or the sentence bearer, let us examine more precisely the evolution of the iconography of the deceased on the funerary wooden models, which responds closely to the changes in religious thought throughout the Middle Kingdom. If the production and transport of foodstuff occupy a central place in the corpus of the models between the end of the Dynasty 6 and the beginning of Dynasty 12, that are phase 1 to 3 of the production of these objects, they are soon abandoned in favor of new themes whose religious significance is clear. The funerary boats that transport the mummified deceased are gradually replacing the simple traveling boats. On these new forms of boats, the deceased is surrounded by the two goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who are represented in different forms. Two women whose hair is sometimes covered with a piece of white cloth placed at each end of the mummy of the deceased, or as here, as two birds identified as kites placed on the top of the canopy that houses the coffin. The whole of these boats, usually painted green, underline the funerary character of these boats. At the same time, solar boats appear, especially at Deir Bersha, and are associated with the god Ra, that is totally linked with the rebirth of the deceased. In this way, through the intermediary of the funerary wooden models, the mummified deceased become an Osiris accompanied by Ra. Between phase 1 and phase 3, the deceased is usually shown seated under a shelter or canopy. Some funerary models show him standing, always sheltered by a more or less complex structure. Moreover, the active character of the deceased is sometimes supported by an external element that links him to the earthly world. He listens to the music, plays senet, listens or watches servants working for him. It thus transposes his earthly life into the world beyond, sometimes adding a symbolic object linked to his rebirth, as the senet game or the lotus flower and bird that sometimes he holds in his hand. From phase 4 onward, the image of the deceased changed radically. He is represented dead, mummified, or wrapped in a shroud, awaiting a rebirth. Moreover, the representation of the mummified deceased, the presence of the two goddesses Isis and Nephthys, and the blue or green color of the earth closely associate this model with the Osirian cult and echo the decoration of the coffins, creating in phase 4 a direct link between the coffin and the models. From the reign of Sesostris I onwards, Isis and Nephthys are invoked in the coffin text, represented at the head and feet of the deceased, thus protecting his body, in the same way as on the boat's models of phase 4. It is this profound change in the very perception of the wooden model that until phase 3 were closely linked to the earthly aspect of the deceased through his statue. It is in the second half of the reign of Sesostris I that they take on the celestial consonants that correspond to that of the coffin. The symbolism of the lying or standing position is of crucial importance here. Indeed, thanks to the ritual of the opening of the house and to the funerary formulas, the mummified deceased will be able to stand up and thus come back to life. The strong religious symbolism of the boats appears as early as the second half of the reign of Sesostris I in phase 4, and its echoes in the corpus of the coffin text. The absence of these two themes between the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the Middle Kingdom leads us to question the date of appearance of the representation of the mummified deceased. 11 models carrying a mummy have been identified and are, by their style and techniques, later than the reign of Amenemhat I. Considering the funerary role of the boats, the question was whether the transport of the dead found another mode of representation in these objects. 6 boats carrying a coffin were identified in phase 2 and 3. Nevertheless, the mummiform representation of the deceased is specific to phase 4, and illustrates the evolution of religious thought that took place during Dynasty 12, transforming the earthly condition of the deceased into a divine being. Between the end of the Old Kingdom and Dynasty 12, the specifically funerary function of the boat is illustrated concretely only 16 times, what is exactly 2.6% of the general corpus of the boats. Although we remain dependent on the hazard of the discoveries and the conservation of the furniture, this number is minimal and nuances the strictly religious symbolic significance that has long been given to this object. However, does the funerary character of a model lie simply in the representation of a coffin or a mummified deceased person? Doesn't the representation of the living deceased also have a long and strong symbolism of rebirth? The shift from the representation of the active deceased to the dead deceased, awaiting rebirth, coincides with the evolution of funerary practices. More specifically, it is the change in the position of the body and the shape of the coffin which embody the profound transformation in religious thought that developed from the second half of the reign of Sesostris I. Gradually, the change in the position of the body of the deceased, placed first literally and then dorsally, can be associated with a change in the orientation of the coffin in the tomb from north-south, which had been used for 2 millennia, to east-west in connection with the rebirth of the sun, which became the norm at the end of the Middle Kingdom. Thus, more than the Osirian rebirth, it is the solar rebirth that is associated with the deceased in his tomb, as shown by the solar boats, or the lotus flowering bird whose solar symbolism is known. The wooden models dated to phase 4 are part of an overall process that gives centrality to the Osirian and solar cults. The essential objective for the deceased, illustrated by formula and wooden models iconography, is therefore to become an Osiris, giving the central place to the embalming ritual, much more often mentioned in the coffin text than used in reality. In this way, the deceased is part of a cyclical renewal, like Osiris returns over his enemies in death, and by extension, is part of the solar race in the cyclical time of renewal. Thus, by surrounding oneself with new means to ensure one's rebirth in the afterlife, such as wooden models or the coffins on which the formulas can be inscribed, the deceased embodies both deities. However, if the rebirth of the sun is only really evoked from the New Kingdom onwards in the royal tombs, the association of Osiris and Ra in the coffin text prefigures the content of the chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead, which unites the two deities. It is Ra who rests in Osiris. It is Osiris who rests in Ra. Thus, the deceased triumph over death is, as written by Anasman, the beginning and the end, yesterday and tomorrow. To conclude, the Osirian cult associated with the solar cult, which underwent a clear development during the reign of Sesostris I, has repercussions on the funerary equipment, which clearly evolved with the appearance of new objects. It is in this context that the corpus of funerary models undergoes its last evolution until the reign of Sesostris III, with the development of the image of the mummified deceased like Osiris and the appearance of solar boats, a final phase which marked the end of the use of wooden funerary models. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gerson, for this presentation of a truly fascinating corpus, and which illustrates the other diachronic axis of variation and change in relation to much broader shifts. Also something we will have plenty to discuss about in the second phase of this afternoon. Let's move on immediately to Dina Serova, Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, problematizing linguistic variation in the coffin text, a case study on spell CT335. Dina?
Oh, thank you. Haven't you skipped someone? I'm sorry, but isn't it Victoria?
Yes, I have. I'm sorry. I was just
I'm sorry,
back
as
to
you
the
like.
CV. Sorry, let's keep to schedule. Victoria. So, Victoria Almanza via Toro, Harvard University, Variation as a Social Device, Middle Egyptianisms in inverted commas in Old Kingdom letters.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here. I'm very glad to be part of this discussion. Let me first say that I practiced this presentation yesterday and I was right on time. So I'm gonna have to be a little bit fast reading so that I'm sure that I stick to time today. Okay, so and okay now. So good speech is more hidden than greenstone, but one can find it with the women at the grindstone. Tahotep sent us a gem of wisdom from the early 2nd millennium BCE. Beautiful speech is difficult to find, and yet one can hear it from the mouths of the most unexpected speakers. This is the same idea behind the surprise of the official Renzi and the pharaoh at the elegant rhetoric of a poor man in the tale of the eloquent peasant. These two examples alone are telling us something that should not come as a surprise to us. First, not all the Egyptians spoke the same way. And second, there were social expectations as to how one should or should not use language. Language can change in a vertical diachronic way. For example, ancient Egyptian has evolved from Old Egyptian all the way to Coptic. The term Old Egyptian was first coined by Baptist Comgan in his work Studies in Egyptian Syntax from 1924. Then in 1955, Elmar Edel published the only comprehensive grammar of Old Egyptian that exists to this day. It is important to realize that too much focus on chronology obfuscates the existence of synchronic linguistic variation. In a horizontal pattern across the same time period, we can have different linguistic manifestations in communicative context, which result in changes in register, across the social class or community of the speaker or hearer, which result in the appearance of sociolects, in different regions with their own dialects, and finally, the dimension of emotion and intention, which allows hearers to perceive the specific feelings of the speaker. What role do archaism, standardization, individuality, and functionality play in the periodization of a language that has only survived to us in textual form? This is one of the questions that I set out to answer in this paper, focusing on the different dimensions that can explain the linguistic variation. There are a few linguistic disciplines that study language in usage. Social linguistics studies linguistic variation across social contexts, and pragmatics analyzes how the meaning of an expression is shaped by the context in which it is uttered. When you sit next to a stranger on a plane and start doing some small talk, you are likely to get more information from the way they are speaking rather than from what they are saying. Language in usage has been enormously understudied for ancient Egyptian. The first and biggest limitation of historical social linguistics of the ancient world is the impossibility to access oral speech. The closest possible corpus for an understanding of linguistic variation across social groups is that composed by personal letters, but they are not straightforward either. I need to state that this research is not aimed at making any sort of assumptions about the way ancient Egyptians sounded across different social contexts. Rather, I am interested in studying how variation can be the result of social expectations about the ways Egyptians should sound or read in different contexts. I am studying written language as a distinct category on its own. In the case of letters, some studies have also touched upon the question of linguistic variation across interpersonal registers. That is, whether an Egyptian author adapts their letters language when addressing a superior, an inferior, or an equal. Language also changes across social contexts, but this is much more difficult to determine in the case of ancient Egypt, where first, the concept of elite and social class remains elusive and of imprecise categorization. And second, literacy was limited to a group of people that, albeit not forming a homogeneous class, shared at least this knowledge as a common identifying factor. In other words, our available evidence is not enough to prove beyond doubt that letter readers belonged to layered and clearly distinguished classes. Finally, there is one more dimension of variation not covered by the standard sociolinguistic categories of synchronic change. I am calling it for now the diapathic dimension. In this paper, I propose a new model to explain linguistic variation as a means and behavior to transmit a sense of identity or an emotion. I argue that the agency of language reflects in the reader's individual communicative choices, resulting on dialectal variation. In this sense, my idea of linguistic agency is closely related with pragmatic speech act theory. In this theory, founded by the philosopher of language, J.L. Austin, advocates for a vision of utterances as actions with an impact beyond communication. The main corpus of this article is composed by all the published and decently preserved Old Kingdom letters sent between private individuals, including also the 6th dynasty letter to the dead preserved in a funerary linen piece from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and 2 first intermediate period letters to the dead, chosen because written on papyrus and excavated from the single site of Nag Hammadi. This table shows the entire corpus with a content classification based on the intention and emotion expressed in the letter, in the 2nd column, and a description based on the hierarchical relations between sender and addressee, the 3rd column. By comparing the Old Kingdom letters between themselves and with the pyramid texts, I set out to explore the different dimensions of variation that occur across time, context, social class, emotions, and intentions. The main question of historical sociolinguistics is concerned with the context of appearance of innovations as opposed to archaisms. Where and how does language change occur first? Accordingly, I will be using the same distinction to guide my quest for linguistic variation. I have divided the corpus linguistic evidence as archaisms and innovations. The linguistic tokens that occur solely in those letters or Middle Kingdom texts have been labeled as Middle Kingdom innovations. The tokens that occur solely in the letters and the pyramid text and occasionally Old Kingdom tomb biographies have been labeled as pyramid text archaisms. And the features that appear throughout all the Middle Kingdom texts are both. This is methodologically helpful, but very teleological. At this moment, I can't think of a better alternative, but I'm open to suggestions. So here is our first slide of data. As it can be observed, most of the linguistic tokens of the Old Kingdom letters represent features that are not exclusive to the pyramid texts or Middle Kingdom. However, there are a few examples of both archaisms and innovations in these letters. Different speeds of diachronic variation can occur at the same synchronic level. One example is the co-occurrence of sek chu as opposed to sek ku or sech chu. The particle sek versus sech, which appears in its innovative form sech in the pyramid text passages that also have the later form of the 2nd person masculine pronoun chu, is attested in letters exclusively as the archaic sek. However, in the same letter where sek is attested, the pronoun chu is also found. It would seem that although an original sek can evolve as sech, contemporary archaic variants can still be linked to specific constructions. In this case, sek introducing subject plus adverb clause. The case of sek-sech is an example of how linguistic variation between the pyramid texts and letters may be, in some cases, more strongly connected to genre-specific differences rather than linguistic conservatism as opposed to colloquialism. Indeed, the innovative sech is more frequent than the archaic sek in the pyramid text, while it is absent from the Old Kingdom letters. Co-occurrences of pyramid text archaisms and Middle Kingdom innovations in the same letter, and even in the same expression, are not rare. Another example is the archaic 3rd masculine singular independent pronoun sut, which is negated with the Middle Kingdom negation nen in a letter sent between officials. The construction is an AB nominal sentence, which would be negated in the pyramid text with me is. The example 4 is the oldest attested use of the negation nen, which will not reappear until the Middle Kingdom. In the Hekanak letters, the author uses the innovation nen only in a letter addressed to a superior. Such findings illustrate the dangers of equating conservative language with prestige and innovations with colloquialism. Some forms, such as the geminated passive, are exclusively attested in the pyramid text and do not show any traceable signs of development or correspondence in the letters. In other cases, it is possible to trace an evolution or variation between the pyramid text and all Old or Middle Kingdom letters, allowing different co-occurring levels of development and lexicalization. For example, the Middle Egyptian particle geret appears in one single instance as iger in the pyramid texts, and often as ger in Old Kingdom letters. The only instance in which the particle geret appears in the Old Kingdom letters, it does so to introduce a protasis following the conditional particle ir, as seen in example 5. This is a very common construction in Middle Kingdom letters, sometimes appearing in variation with ger as well. So I now turn to identify the specific context in which variation occurs with account of the different dimensions of change. The diastratic dimension is difficult to identify a priori due to the limitations of our knowledge of historical and social patterns of the Old Kingdom, as I explained before. However, by observing the phenomenon of honorifics as pronoun replacement, one can determine hierarchical relationships. Letters sent to superiors, inferiors, or equals can yield diastratic evidence when the letter readers adapt their language to fit societal standards. As a first step in the diastratic assessment, it is necessary to identify linguistic variation across hierarchical relationships. My findings are summarized in this table. And this is a more visual representation of it. Archaisms and innovations are a minority in the letters, but between the two, archaisms seem to be more frequent, particularly in letters to equals. In letters to inferiors, innovations are slightly more frequent, although the marked presence of archaisms in letters to equals could indeed be pointing to the existence of a shared sociolect in use between members of the same demographic group. The results admittedly do not otherwise show a clear pattern. Therefore, I need to conclude that the Old Kingdom letters do not offer compelling evidence of linguistic variation across hierarchical contexts. Neither pyramid text archaisms nor Middle Kingdom innovations seem to be consciously used in contexts of prestige. This chart below plots a graphic description of linguistic variation in each particular letter, among those most linguistically representative. It allows a clearer division between a group of letters that use more archaisms and another group that prefers innovations. Accordingly, I have named them the archaic and the innovative group. This table shows that the variation found in the letters cannot be definitely assigned to the existence of either geographical, diatopic, or social diastratic dialects. The only pattern that can be reconstructed from the available evidence is that letter readers with titles associated with the state administration and letters from Saqqara are only part of the archaic group. Rather than a sociolect, however, this correlation could be pointing to the dialect of a community of speakers involved in the capital's affairs. Therefore, variation cannot be clearly attributed to either geographical or social differences in the Old Kingdom letters. If the choice of innovative as opposed to archaic forms is not group dialectal, it must be idiolectal. Pseudo-verbal forms with these meanings, common in the Middle Kingdom, are completely absent from the pyramid texts, despite having Old Kingdom attestations as early as Hufu's reign. This is explained as secular texts being linguistically closer to oral speech than the pyramid texts, which showcase archaic language. However, I have discussed above how problematic it is to assume that the language of the pyramid text is always archaic. Moreover, the pyramid texts seem to occasionally reflect spoken language as well, specifically in the gods and kings dialogues. Rather, the differing attestations of pseudo-verbal forms between the letters and the pyramid text is due to speech agency. In the first example, I don't know why I have the two things coming up at the same time, but okay. So, the sender complains that the addressee is not doing his job in the fields properly and uses a menacing tone to threaten him with legal actions. Example 2 is uttered by an overseer of the army who is contesting the vizier's order to move the troops to Saqqara to get clothing. The sentence in example 3 is a promise made by a son to his father, and that he will comply with what has been ordered to him. The emotions are anger and need for persuasion, and the actions are complaint and promise. Therefore, emotions and intention seem to have a huge impact on linguistic choice. The pseudo-verbal forms are needed to convey the urgency of the threat, emphasize the complaint, and promise compliance. There are different possible explanations for the association of pseudo-verbal forms and speech agency. The option that I prefer is that pseudo-verbal forms, as well as other Middle Kingdom innovations, are forms of animated language used in the north and south of Egypt, and introduced the letters as a means and social device. I will conclude that the Old Kingdom letters are examples of Old Kingdom literary Egyptian, just like the pyramid texts, which they closely resemble, with occasional code switching to another dialect, which now we are equipped to label semi-colloquial Egyptian. Changing between dialects or languages, known as code switching, occurs for different reasons. René Appel and Peter Misken argued that two of the functions of code switching are to express emotions and emphasize a change in tone for crucial parts of the conversation. In the Old Kingdom, pure colloquial language is perhaps only to be found in tomb speech captions. Although written language, they are meant to imitate spoken language, unlike personal letters, which can only yield colloquialisms as a result of authors' intentions. Moreover, Middle Kingdom innovations tend to be used in expressions of positive politeness. That is, the kind of politeness that makes the addressee feel appreciated by the sender, such as this example of a rhetorical question used as part of several other indirect strategies to make a request. Rhetorical questions, like positive politeness, is a form of cooperative communication that assumes common grounds between communicants, thus emphasizing that they share goals and understanding. After studying politeness strategies in letters for my dissertation, I concluded that the Old Kingdom Egyptian way to use politeness is to emphasize proximity rather than distance. Similarly, language throughout the epistolary corpus appears largely uniform rather than diastratically, diatopically, or diaphasically diverse. In this paper, I have explored the different dimensions of variation across Old Kingdom letters, focusing on pyramid text and Middle Kingdom features, which I tentatively labeled pyramid text archaisms and Middle Kingdom innovations. I then tried to identify their context of appearance by assessing hierarchical relations of sender-addressee, social environment of the letters, and geography. Besides traces of a possible archaic dialect that seems to be more recurrent among individuals involved in the state administration, those tests did not yield remarkable linguistic differences that could be ascribed to specific groups. And I want to emphasize that when I say archaic, is again this methodological problem that I have. I'm not assuming that this is actually an archaic, an older dialect. Variation, however, was occurring at the idiolectal individual level in each letter. Particularly, Middle Kingdom innovations appears associated with the expression of strong emotions and the use of language with particular agentive intentions. I have labeled this synchronic avenue of language variation, of linguistic variation, the diapathic dimension. So two questions remain to answer. First, how standardized was truly standard Old Kingdom literary Egyptian, if there is such a thing? The pyramid texts show a great degree of internal variation, and the letters could use colloquialisms in addition to literary language. And second, at which point and why does semi-colloquial Egyptian become the literary language? If colloquial Middle Kingdom innovations are not exclusive of Upper Egypt, then the idea of a state-promoted shift to the southern dialect of the new Theban capital becomes obsolete. While regional dialects may have existed, they were never put in writing. The colloquialisms in letters are evidencing another level of spoken Egyptian that could be used for written communication and that did not have any geographical attachment. Perhaps the answer as to why colloquial Egyptian achieved literary status does not rest so much on direct centralized impositions, but on the individual experimental initiative of scribal schools and traditions, mimicking a contemporary trend of innovative peripheral provincial art that sought separation from royal models. Colloquial Egyptians could have been used by reactionary writers to compose their classical works of literature. So colloquial Egyptian could have achieved literary status through artistic creativity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and it's nice to hear that the humans are back in the play, and the humans with their emotions. So we'll hear more about that this afternoon, I'm sure. As we are running a little late, let's move directly to Dina Serova, and apologies again for the mix-up. Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, problematizing linguistic variation in the coffin text, a case study on spell CT 335.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see everything. Yeah, fine. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity Carlos gave to me to present my work today. I'm currently working in a collaborative research center in Berlin dealing with register variation and linguistic variation. And I'm also very happy to be part of the Middle Kingdom Theban project led by Antonio Morales, So what is happening here today is actually that I'm trying to bring these two project works together, which is actually the coffin text and the linguistic variation. So in the work of MKTP and Del Bahri and the tomb of Ipi, TT 315, here you can see a plan of the tomb. We were working in the sarcophagus chamber, and the sarcophagus we have there is made of limestone. It's monolithic, it's fully decorated inside, but partly has a very bad condition. So there seemed to have been some kind of a fire, and which led to a chemical reaction, which then led to an inversion of the ink, which you can see here. So what was black here turned to white. We have abrasions, we have cutting to the sarcophagus wall, sorry. And also there were blows to the stone and pieces are missing. But we have to work with what we have, right? So when we started translating, we figured out that the east wall of the sarcophagus has a sequence of two spells, namely CT 335 and then CT 397 following. So it's natural then to open up the book and to have this synoptic overview. And what is happening always when philologists look at synoptic overviews is that we encounter a lot of linguistic variation within the texts, linguistic variation on different semantic levels. And this brings me to some thoughts on definitions. We know that variation is inherent to the nature of language. That means that reoccurring conventionalized collocations of linguistic variation can form varieties, such as dialects, chronolects, sociolects, idiolects. And these are put in relation to specific extra-linguistic factors. And these outer factors encompass, among others, the time period, the geographical space, the situational setting in which a communication is taking place, communication or text production. And these varieties, they are interrelated in an organized way. And we just heard it in the talk before by Victoria, who was also talking about these dimensions by Coserio. So Coserio said that every language system exhibits a unique architecture which can be described in 3 dimensions, actually diatopic, diastratic, and diaphasic. And here you can see this interrelation to extra-linguistic factors. And as a fourth, let's say, overarching perspective, he proposed the diachronic dimension. We can say that all 3 other dimensions in this architecture can be approached diachronically. And so in this sense, variability is the range of observed variation in a heterogeneous system. Now let me flip this a little bit all over and visualize that. So if we think about linguistic variation, we think about linguistic features. And as I said before, these are interrelated with extra-linguistic factors. And in linguistics, we distinguish between 2 kinds of factors. So variability has 2 origins. The first one is the between subject or inter-speaker user-based variation. And the second one is the within subject intra-speaker usage-based variation. So the first one, the interspeaker, means that linguistic differences occur between individuals of different social or ethnic origin, age, and gender. This is where we would put the dimensions of diatopic and diastratic in this model. And on the right, in the intra-speaker usage-based variation, would mean that differences in text production occur within one and the same individual who adopts his or her language according to the communicative context, which is the situation, space, time, topic, and so on. So this is where we would put the diaphasic dimension. And you can see the terms field, tenor, mode here. This is from systemic functional linguistics by Halliday and Hassan and others. This is, let's say, a way to approach diaphasic variation. And all this brings me to the notion of register. So register are those aspects of socially recurring intra-individual variation that are influenced by situational and functional settings. So if we think about an interaction or communication, whether oral or written, it's the same. We would have a situational context on one side and linguistic forms on the other side. and their relation is governed by communicative function or goal or purpose of communication. So let me just shortly give you an example from English, modern English, so you can relate a bit better. First example is, my mom is ticked off versus my mother is angry. Both sentences can describe the same state of affairs, but they are appropriate in different situations. So it's a matter of formality. The second example would be, it is 7:53 p.m. versus it is around 8 o'clock. So both expressions are used to report the time of the same event, but they have different contexts of use. To sum this up, the level of formality, purpose, status of the interlocutor in social projections and so on, these are situational or functional features that influence the choice of one variant over the other. That means that a language user's ability to negotiate the space or to navigate through this linguistic variation, both as a text producer as well as an addressee, constitutes their register knowledge. Okay, now let's go back to Egyptology, right? What does this mean? And what do we touch upon if we talk about this? So this approach touches upon questions related to text production in general in ancient Egypt, but also questions related to open versus closed transmission, intertextuality, and textualization of mortuary texts. And this brings me actually to the coffin text spell CT335, which we are going to talk about now. So this is the most distributed coffin text spell in the Middle Kingdom, and it has a very complex transmission history. It is found in more than 37 supports with 44 witnesses of different length. It is the precursor of BD17, which is the most distributed BD spell from New Kingdom onwards. In the Middle Kingdom, CT335 is attested in two versions, in a basic, unglossed, or let's say in a short version, and in a long one, an extended one, which also has glosses or parentheses. And these glosses are partly question and answer elements and other elements which are inserted and kind of interrupt the flow of the basic text. And the basic text is actually a monologue. So there's kind of like an intrusion of mini dialogues. And these textual additions have attracted much scholarly attention in respect to the form and content. And there's a lot of discussion going on. In general, we can say that these parenthetical expressions offer variant understandings on several theological topics, which mostly refer to the previously mentioned text unit, and thus reveal insights into intellectual discourse. I will give you an example. This example is from this coffin, this text passage. So we assume that we have a monologue by a speaker A. In this case, it's probably the deceased himself. And this monologue seems to be interrupted by a mini dialogue. So there is another speaking instance asking a question, namely, but what is that? And the response given seems also to be attributable to the same speaking instance as the speaker of the monologue. And these additions or this phenomenon happens very often in many attestations of the long version of the spell. So we were talking in the beginning about extra linguistic factors. And I think in order to be able even to approach diaphasic dimension or register in text in general, it's important to keep these outer factors as stable as possible. So this is why I decided to focus on the synchronical and local attestations of the spell. And the CT335, this is the full list up to now, the updated list for Thebes in Middle Kingdom. You can also see Epi's sarcophagus here. And what is visible on first glance is actually that we have two text pairs, namely the one by Mentuhotep and the one by Harhotep, which exhibit two versions in one, let's say, context or contextual setting. I would like now to focus on Harhotep. So this composition, it's very complex. Let's say it's matryoshka-like, and it is a nested text picture composition. It has been 3D modeled and scanned by Morales and Osman in 2018. It's now kept in the Cairo Museum. Here are some pictures I took from the internet. So what you can see on the first glance, that we have a very tight and tiny space. We have the chamber walls, which are decorated with hieroglyphic bandeau. We have the representations of objects like the 7 holy oils, but we also have in columns, we have inscription with the coffin text. The sarcophagus itself stands in the center of it, and it is decorated inside, but also outside with coffin text spells, which is quite unusual. This is what I mean with matryoshka-like or nested composition. And also it has a lot of many false doors and offering lists. If we now look on the distribution of the spell in the tomb or in the chamber, we can see that let's say the placement is not overlapping, it's not congruent, but it's slightly spatially offset. If I say it's not overlapping, I'm referring, for example, to the context of Mentuhotep, where the same spell, the CT335, is placed on the lids of the coffin. So let's say when the lids are above each other, there is an overlap. Also symbiotically, there is an overlap. This is not the case in this context, but what is happening here is actually that the placement of the spell in the entrance area of the burial chamber is quite prominent and it's quite central. And it lies, at least conceptually, in the visual axis of a potential viewer. So if we think about this composition and the design and layout, it is quite central, and it's also seems to focus in the head area of the sarcophagus. I think this is meaning driven. Now let's have a short look on the phrasal composition of both versions in the same context. What you can see on first glance is that they are not really congruent. There's a lot of things going on. And when I did this and also made a transliteration of the texts, I was trying to systematize the variation I was able to observe. And I think there are 4 types of variation. I don't think I will have time to go through all of this, but I will just shortly show it to you. The first one would be the presence or absence of phrases. So while the version on the chamber wall has the basic version, the short one, the version on the sarcophagus has a long version, but it does not incorporate question and answer elements, but incorporates jet meadow recitation and then the answer, or what is the answer in other examples or attestations. From a total of 314 phrases, actually I got this information from Yorke's dissertation. So the version of the sarcophagus has 197 phrases, but only 1/3 of them is also attested on the chamber wall. So that means that both witnesses actually just share a number of 59 identical phrases. So the version on the sarcophagus of the spell is not only longer, but actually it's just the longest attestation of the spell in the Theban area in this time at all, in general. The second type would be the phrase order. I think I will skip this and we will talk about it perhaps in the discussion. The main part would be the linguistic variation. In general, the common parts of these 59 phrases is kept kind of stable, but we can observe a minor number of linguistic variation. Although it's minor and although it's few, there are few variants. They have a very strong effect on the communicative structure and the understanding of the text. So for example, there is very often in some passages, the omission of the first personal pronoun suffixes in the version of the chamber wall. Reasons might be that we have limited space, or other reasons might be that there are other decorum rules governed here, because we shouldn't forget that we're actually dealing with 2 different media there. So a chamber wall is not the same as a sarcophagus. Perhaps there are other conventions of decoration and writing here attributed here. However, the effect of this is that some of the sentences in this version have no marked subject, so that the speaker and addressee roles are unclear. That means that the text passages are partly difficult to understand and become obscure. Also, there are some unexpected personal deictic leaps from first person to third person. So normally scholars would say, yeah, this is corrupt, or this version is corrupt. There are mistakes. There are a lot of errors, and this might be correct. But also, I think we have to state that it shows us clearly that there was a very strong editorial and redactional work on both versions, because they occur in the same situational, contextual setting. It seems to me that even if there are mistakes in this version, the variation between them is on purpose. And this also explains, actually, this is also from Yorke's dissertation, this also explains why when stemmata or phylograms or dendrograms are provided to explain how the textual criticism works between all these attestations, this is why we see that these two witnesses are so far from each other, although they are found in the same setting, right? And as a fourth thing, I will just be very short with that. The version on the chamber wall shows a very high degree of reduction and abbreviation on the level of writing. And at the same time, the version on the sarcophagus shows a lot of graphic extension by implementation of phonetic complements and classifiers. So the text appears visually longer and takes up much more space on the writing medium. Here, an example. Now let me come to an end. Let me hypothesize a bit. So what does this all mean? Is CT 335 in its short and long versions composed in one and the same language register? Do we have to assume a register homogeneity for the spell, which then would develop with the time, let's say diachronically, or change with the time? Or do we have to understand the spell in its long version as heterogeneous and incorporating two or more different registers? And as a follow-up question, would this mean then, does the monologue, which is the short version, reflect register X, and these dialogue additional structures would be register Y? And even if so, how to model this? It's clear that I cannot answer this right now, but I hope I was able to tease a little bit this subject and to open up a window for further discussion of the investigation of diaphasic dimensions and register. And I think one of the possibilities to approach this might be systemic functional linguistics and the parameters field tenor mode, and especially the aspect of tenor. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dina, for this very clear and detailed presentation. So you didn't answer about registers, but that's a question that might come up in an hour or so then. Okay, so we shall move back to material culture with Elisabeth Krug from Universität Wien, occurrences of grave goods and their representations on coffins, a concept of substitution? Question mark.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can see my presentation. And since I'm the last speaker today, I try to hurry up a bit. But first of all, I would like to thank Carlos for giving me the possibility to share my ideas here in this context. And since you're all specialists in this topic, I'm a bit nervous, but I'm looking forward to our discussion, as I already enjoyed the discussions of the last 2 days very much. So. Presentation is not working, right?
Seems to be working now.
Okay, now perfect. You can see it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Grave goods are a constant element of burials at all time in ancient Egyptian history. During the time of the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom, they do not only occur in their three-dimensional form in the tombs, but also as decorative elements in the so-called object friezes painted inside the coffins. The similarity between these depicted objects and the three-dimensional grave goods is conspicuous, as you can see it here in some examples. This big coincidence in the different manifestations of the objects leads to the question of whether there is a connection between the three-dimensional objects and their representations. In this context, the question arises as to whether a grave good can be replaced by its pictorial representation or vice versa. Is there an underlying principle of substitution for the inclusion of grave goods and their representations on coffins and burials of the Middle Kingdom? Since the vast majority of burials in ancient Egypt have been looted, we often get only a fragmentary impression of the amount of burial goods. However, to be able to determine whether an object is being substituted by its pictorial representation or not, it is necessary to ensure that the burial was found intact and that no object has been looted. Therefore, the first prerequisite of the context of the burials to answer the question of a possible concept of substitution is the integrity of the burial. Therefore, I choose an intact burial of the Middle Kingdom as a case study to discuss this possible concept of substitution. So first, I will show you an intact burial of the Middle Kingdom, the burial of Gemni-Menhat, what is my case study. Then introduce the different functions of the burial equipment, the reference to daily life, the reference to social status of the tomb owner, and the reference to rituals. And finally, I will discuss the possible concept of the substitution of grave goods and their representations in the object friezes in the burial of Gemni-Menhat. An intact burial of the early Middle Kingdom is the burial of Emir Per, overseer of the house Gemni-Menhat. The funerary complex of Gemni-Menhat was found during the excavation of Cecil Melleby I in 1921-1922. Based on an analysis of the objects contained in this burial, as well as a detailed study of the decoration and inscriptions on the coffins of Gemni-Menhat, considering paleographic and stylistic features, the burial of Gemni-Menhat can be dated to the end of the 11th dynasty. The tomb of Gemni-Menhat lies north of the enclosure wall of the Pyramid of Teti, between its perimeter wall and the mastabas of the Old Kingdom. Only a few fragments of the superstructure of the tomb, which had been a mud brick mastaba, have survived. The underground complex of Gemni-Menhat consists of a vertical shaft hewn directly into the bedrock about 8 meters deep. After about 6 meters, a chamber opens in the south wall of the shaft. The entrance of this chamber was completely closed with mud bricks when it was found, so that all the grave goods were preserved, as you can see it here on the picture, with a view to the burial chamber of Gemni-Menhat. The burial chamber of Gemni-Menhat, in the burial chamber of Gemni-Menhat, the burial equipment was placed outside and inside the coffin. Outside the coffin, 5 boat models, a wooden model of a workshop with a carpenter, a smith and a potter scene, a spinning and a weaving scene, a laundry, a brewery, and a granary accompanied the burial. The wooden model of a kitchen combines scenes of slaughtering, baking, and brewing. Furthermore, 2 wooden statues of the offering bearers and 2 statues of the tomb owner, also of wood, were located south of the coffin. The models of a granary and the brewery were placed on the top of a canopic chest of Gemni-Menhat. In first published excavation report, there are only sketches of the pottery found in the burial. The vessel depicted on the right can be identified as a conical beaker. That on the left presumably depicts one of the 4 ovoid vessels that first designated as jars. The painted large carinated bowl contained bovine bones. The mummy of Gemni-Menhat was placed in an ensemble of an outer and an inner coffin. The outer coffin was in a significantly poor state of preservation at its discovery, and only the decoration on the interior of both sides of the coffin were illustrated in the publication. In the archive of the Griffith Institute, I could also identify some photographs of the underside of the lid on the top of the slide here, and the inside of the foot in the notebooks of Battiscombe George Gunn. However, the inner coffin is in a very good state of preservation. Like most of the grave goods of the burial, it is now in the collection of the Ny Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen. The outside of the coffins of Gemnium Hart are decorated with offering formulas and a pair of ujat eyes on the east side of the coffins. On the inside of the coffins, the decoration essentially consists of offering formulas, an offering table and an offering list on the east side, and an object frieze on the north, south, and west side of the coffins. Pyramid texts were placed on the inside of the lid of the outer and the inner coffin, as well as on the bottom of the inner coffin. The bottom of the outer coffin is lost. The mummy was covered with several fringed clothes, lay on its left side facing eastwards. A mummy mask was placed over the head and the shoulders of Gemnium Hart. His head rested on an alabaster headrest. A large broad collar and a small model of a hazard vase in gilded wood were placed on Gemnium Hart's chest, and a collar of gilded wooden beads around his neck. Beside this, bracelets and anklets, as well as 2 more necklaces, were found inside the coffin. The original position of the sandals of Gemnium Hart is unknown. A total of 5 sticks, 2 bows, and a throwing stick or pech aha were placed inside the coffin in front of the mummy. By analyzing the function of the burial equipment of the burial of Gemnium Hart on the basis of archaeological, image, and textual sources, it became clear that most of the grave goods had a meaning as objects of daily use. In this function, the burial equipment, domestic pottery, headrests, sticks, and sandals, or models showing production of these objects, supplies the material provision of the deceased. But not only. On the basis of image and especially textual sources, it is obvious that many objects, for example headrests and sandals, are not commodities of daily life of everyone. This level of meaning of grave goods as a commodity of a certain social class implies that the choice of objects represented also affirms the social status of the deceased. However, this meaning of the grave goods as material provision of the deceased or representation of the deceased social status is, in my opinion, not the only significance that can be linked to these objects. It is possible to differentiate domestic ware from ritual pottery in the ceramic assemblage of undisturbed burials of the early Middle Kingdom. This indicates that the pottery placed in these tombs served not only as material provision for the deceased. Ritual vessels like the hazard bottle or the washing set were used in ceremonial contexts like libation or the offering ritual that also played a role during the funeral. This link between grave goods and the ritual practices of the funeral applies also for other grave goods. A central cult act of the funeral ritual is the offering of food. This ritual is at different times visually in form of an offering table and textually in form of an offering list present in the funerary context. The offering of food also appears 3-dimensionally in the burial of Gemnium Hart in the form of pottery of domestic ware. These vessels were not only used for the storage and presentation of food in everyday life, but were also present during the offering of food, as a depiction of the offering table shows. And the offerings that were part of these tables were, for example, produced in the wooden models. The headdress and sandals that are also often pictured on the head and foot of the coffins can be linked to rituals that take place in the purification tent, as Harco Willems has shown. Which utensils are used in this specific context is evident from the representation of the purification tent in the 6th dynasty mastaba of Mereruka, which is sited directly north of the burial complex of Gemnium Hart. In this scene, the utensils are designated as Debehu and Hemet Chori Hebet, needed or essential for the purification tent, for the equipment of the lecture priest. and comparable objects in the 6th dynasty tomb of Ka at Giza are unequivocally labeled elements of the purification tent Debehu and Ibu need for the purification tent. How these items were utilized is shown in a scene in the 18th dynasty tomb of Usa TT21. In Thebes, where the Chenemet-Wer, the Senuja, and the Anj signs are shown in use. Grave goods that can be connected to these cultic acts, like the headdress, the sandals, or the ritual vessels, were also present in three-dimensional form in the burial of Gemniemhat. The preparation of the body of the deceased is also linked to the ritual of embalming, in which the textiles covering the body played a role, as does the canopic chest, which are used to store and preserve the embalmed organs, or the mummy mask, which covered and preserved the face of the deceased. Another important ritual, which was also performed as part of the funeral, and which served to ritually resurrect the statue or mummy and enable it to breathe or eat, is the opening of the mouth ritual that can be connected to the grave goods mummy mask or the statue of the tomb owner that were also present in Gemniemhat's tomb. Common to all grave goods is the association with ritual practices within the funeral ritual. The burial equipment cannot be interpreted solely as objects that are necessary for the afterlife of the deceased and as his material provision. By the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, burial equipment includes traces of ritual practices at the funeral. The objects are symbolic of ritual acts performed. The ritual must not necessarily have to be performed with the objects themselves, but the objects referenced to the particular ritual are reminiscent. The ritual acts to which the grave goods of the intact burials can be linked are the purification ritual, the ritual of offering of food, the destruction of the animal ritual, the opening of the mouth ritual, the embalming ritual, the hourly vigils, the object ritual, ritual journeys by boat, and ritual dances. These essential ritual acts of the funeral, in which the grave goods play a role as ritual utensils, are recognizable in representations of the funeral ritual of different eras and well documented by texts. As a study of Wilhelm's Daams and Bacchus of individual coffins have shown, the depictions and texts attached to the coffins also have connection to distinctive cultic acts of the burial ritual. Thus, the headrest on a small table and a sieve-like object, which can be identified as a Chenemet-Wer from the inscription, and two bags with eye paint on the north wall of the interior coffin, as well as the two Anj signs, a Megarek and a Senuja above the sandals, and two bags of eye paint on the south wall of the coffin, can be linked to the already described rituals in the purification tent, for example. The offering table and the vessels and foodstuff on the east side of the coffins, as well as the offering list, can be connected to the offering of food ritual. And the objects on the inner sides of the west side of the coffins of Gemniemhat that show different kind of jewelry and several kinds of staffs and weapons can be linked to the liturgy of carrying of the funeral equipment to the tomb, the so-called object ritual. Generally, it is asserted that the objects shown in the friezes of the coffin of Gemniemhat are elements of rituals that are performed during the funeral. In this way, the coffin acts like a ritual machine, referring to Wilhelm's, and the ritual symbolism of the coffin decoration throughout concentrates on funerary situations. Many of the grave goods of Gemniemhat occur physically and as two-dimensional depictions in the object frieze. All in all, it can be stated that the grave goods that occur in three-dimensional form in the tomb or related aspects also appear in pictorial form on the inside of the coffins of Gemniemhat. The comparison of the grave goods and their depictions on the coffins of Gemniemhat shows that no concept of substitutions in the form that the image of a burial equipment replaces the three-dimensional form of a burial equipment or vice versa can be recognized. As a comparison of the interpretation of the objects in the object frieze with the significance of the grave goods have shown, Both have strong connections to cultic acts that are performed during the funeral and refer to the same ritual activities. The objects can be related to different rituals, which are more or less pronounced. So, for example, a connection to the purification ritual can be established for the sandals as well as a link to the object ritual. The same applies, for example, for the headdress, while with view to the mummy mask, the opening of the mouth ritual or the embalming ritual is much more present. This means that grave goods and their representations can refer to the same cultic acts of the funerary ritual, but in addition, different ritual utensils of these acts can appear in different forms. However, substitution could be considered at another level, where the function of a grave good, its connection to specific cultic acts or specific role in the ritual context of the funeral is substituted. Despite this concept of functional substitution, which considers different forms of burial objects and their relation to different cultic acts of the burial ritual, it is important to keep in mind the various factors that can influence the composition of a burial. Beside temporal and regional influences on the funeral context and the status of the buried person, individuality probably played a bigger role than we previously assumed when looking for patterns and regularities when looking at ancient Egyptian burials. Personal preferences, influence of family members or of the tomb owner, but also the time of death are circumstances that have influenced the composition of the burial equipment, the compilation of the images and text of the coffins, and the design of the burial as a whole. For this reason, a standard or minimum equipment with regard to the grave goods or their representations cannot be expected. Nevertheless, both in connection with the grave goods contained in the burial of Gemni-Emhad, and when looking at the decoration on his coffins, central cultic acts of the funeral ritual can be recognized that are tangible in different manifestations, three-dimensional object or pictorial or even textual form. Since grave goods and the decoration of the coffin share the same ritual symbolism, concentrates on funerary situations, as Harco Willems has stated it in the book about the coffin of Hekata, grave goods and coffin act together to realize the funerary ritual and make it permanent, ensuring the ritual provision of the deceased for eternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's another talk that speaks about individuality and circumstances at the end. Okay, let's have a short break, and I suggest we reconvene at 4 sharp because we're already running a little late, and so we still have time for a nice discussion. So let's be back at 4 sharp. Thanks. Hello back, everyone. Just looking, is everyone back? Yes. Okay, second part of the afternoon discussion session. I immediately give the floor to Carlos, who wants to frame the discussion, I guess, best.
Hello, Andres. Thank you very much for conducting the first part of the session. I was amazed with the quantity of things I was thinking about after reading your papers today and listening to your presentations. And I think I will write to you individually for many specific topics, but I have 4 ideas that I would like to share with all of you and to hear what you think about. The first one is the opposition, absence or presence of something. You have been talking about Yorke, of course, about the presence of the wow, for example, or the yod with the A1, or different variants of this presence of absence of yod, the vertical stroke, for example, and so on. The same thing I found very interesting, the distinction you made, Gigi, between the presence or absence of the figures in the models, so that clearly there is another tracer. The presence of the absence of an element can give a lot of information about the use of the all the symbolic or conceptual use, if you want, of an element or a group of elements inside the system. In this case, the mortuary or funerary system. Also, Dina mentioned the case of the presence or absence of the specific elements. Another idea, also, or position of two ideas, is that of substitutions, or as opposed to redundancy. And I think DISA has dealt more in extension with the problem, but also Seria yesterday about how the 3D objects, the models or other burial goods, are or can be substituted or added to the representations and also to the texts. So how important is, or how important can be the presence, the simultaneous presence of the three levels of expression, or how they can complement each other or substitute at some point, depending on other circumstances. I think that would be interesting to reflect upon. Another thing that I was thinking about, it could be relevant as a tracer of something or with some meaning, is that the case that is quite, I find quite amazing that the object in the object friezes usually are, or almost always are, accompanied by a label, so something written, which is not the case of the burial goods. So the burial goods are usually an epigraphic. You have the object, and that's it. It's the presence which counts, as apparently doesn't need an explanation or an instruction on how to use it. But there are some exceptions. As far as I learned from your article, Gigi, there are some goods, some models that sometimes they have some description. Not many, but it's quite rare, but it can be the case. And finally, another reflection, and I know there's a lot here to talk about or to disregard, is that the importance that doing things well or properly. So we have seen a lot of models that are pieces of art, or we consider that as beautiful pieces of art. Others are simply very badly done, or very roughly done. So, but the function stands. So the function is that they need to be there for some reason. And I was thinking if quality there, and you discussed that in your article too, quality in the more broader sense. So if one thing is properly done, it's important for the thing to be efficient, to accomplish the function it is intended to accomplish. And this I connected with the omissions that I found very interesting. The omissions that Dina remarked for one of the versions of the 335 spell in Harhotep chamber. If the first person suffix omissions can be treated at the same level, or can be connected with this kind of bad or improper quality of the material in some way. So there are my ideas. You can take them or put all the different ideas there.
Yes, thanks, Carlos. Well, you have all heard the question. So who wants to take word? Please raise your hands, either the yellow one or the real ones. Gerson, please.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos, for these remarks and analysis of all these talks that are, like, as you say, very linked together. So it's very interesting to see how the text and answer to the production of some kind of object. And your talk also, Elizabeth, was great. I'm so happy to listen and your work. So we are totally complemented each other. So I think at the point that Carlos wanted, and we are, I think we did the job. So that's great. So to answer to your remarks, Carlos, about, for example, the inscriptions on the models. Yeah, we have some of them. Most are the granaries that give the name of the type of the grains that are inside. It's something that seems to be the way to give a precision on the kind of grain that is in the granary. One of the analysis that I understand of this object is that, and it's something also that can be linked to the quality of this production, is that what is important is what is represented. If you just have, for example, on a brewery, you will have someone preparing, you have a jar, you have just one person preparing the mixing for the beer. You don't have to develop the scene to know what is represented. You need to have a brewer, you have a brewery. And then in the main important period of the production, that is the end of 11th dynasty, beginning of 12, until the maximum, I mean, the first, you see this development of all these pieces of art that we recognize. Most of them are beautiful. But this is something that can be linked to the social status that you speak about, Elizabeth, that it's not necessary to be beautiful, to be useful, but you can show, even if these objects are not visible for any spectator, and it depends, because there is another point about that, but you have access to a specific workshop, to a specific craftsman. You have access to trained craftsmen, and this is the way that you can show your status also, having access to this kind of workshop. And everything is linked, not just the wooden models. You make the link with every wooden production, of course, the coffins, but of course, to have a clear vision of your status, you have to look at all the funerary equipment. This is the point to understand your status. And it's something that can be, it's very funny because if you just look at the models, most of the time they are just simple, but they work. And if you just have the look on the models, you say, oh yeah, this one was not on the high society, it didn't have access to this workshop. But no, not at all, it's not this. The function is here, you have access to models. The models are part of a very high, important funerary equipment. And for example, it's in the tomb of, I lose his name in Sedment, at the end of 6th dynasty. I will not find it again. I will put it on the chat then. But when you look at his models, they are very simple. They are not very beautiful. But as soon as you look at the statues of the owner, you realize that they were ebony, cedar, high quality wood, crafting is perfect. So you have to join the analysis of all this production to understand who is the owner of this material. And the quality is something that is also put on the light in a suit, because we know that a wooden model is always on the funerary chamber, but not all the time, as shown the tomb of Nahti, for example. Because we know that when Chasina Palang discovered the tomb of Nahti, they found the most beautiful wooden models of this collection in the chapel. So if it was placed in the chapel with the most beautiful statue also of Nahti, it was to be seen. So to highlight the status of this important man of Asyut. So we miss a lot of chapels of this public part of the tomb. in many necropolis of Middle Egypt. And for example, in Beni Hassan, we have a lot of models, very simple, but we just have one small statue. Where are the others? They were in the chapel that are, well, all disappeared. We miss many information. That's why we have to link everything. And yeah, I stopped, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Elisabeth. You had something to respond or take up the discussion at this point?
Thank you very much, Gazan. I'm so happy that we now meet in a way, because I always wanted to talk to you and I have so many questions and I try to reduce it now. But also with view to what you said now, where do we find the wooden models? Because for example, in MORTEXVAR3, you also have this chamber that is especially made for the wooden models, but nevertheless you have some models or traces of the models in the burial chamber, and there you find, for example, these small these items that can be connected to the opening of the mouse ritual. So for example, I think also there's a question, so we have different levels of meaning, and in this case the wooden model that has these small wooden items is connected to the opening of the mouse ritual, but nevertheless, you have another model with the same object that has another function and it's placed on a different place. So this is something what came into my mind now. But concerning what Carlos said, with the inscriptions in the object friezes, because this is also interesting that for example, in the coffins of Gemni and Phat, some objects have inscriptions, but not all of them. So you cannot say every object has an inscription that is accompanied by it. So it's also, this are different levels of meaning. So you have a frieze of objects in a written form and an independent object frieze in pictures. So this is also something what we have to keep in mind, that the inscriptions do not just say the same like the pictures, but maybe have a known level of meaning for that. And another thing is that, for example, in some object friezes, you have a headrest, and on this headrest, the name of the tomb owner or the coffin owner is written. So in this case, you have on an object frieze another level of meaning insofar as the statues of the tomb owner, he put his own name on this one headrest, for example, is also added. So I think we have to think in several levels of meaning with view to different manifestations, texts, pictures, and also objects. And they can substitute, but they can also accompany each other. And so both is possible.
Rune, you had to raise your hand first.
Yes, just to follow up on that, I think probably you said most of what I was going to say, but I agree that we should sort of, beyond thinking about substitution versus redundancy, we should also think about the affordances of the different media. So you can do different things. It tends to be easier to add a caption on a two-dimensional surface than it is on a three-dimensional object, or at least more. It seems to have been more natural. So we see similar things also if we compare the models to two-dimensional tomb scenes, where we see many of the same motifs, of course, but it's much easier to add captions and identify the people and the actions and so on those tomb scenes. So again, I've sort of pushed back a little against the notion of the necessary anonymity of the models, that they're sort of a faceless group of people. But if we look at similar scenes in two dimensions, we actually quite often do get captions identifying the individual persons. So it seems to have to do also with the affordances and the fact that we we do very occasionally find written identifications of the persons depicted, especially offering bearers, but also, for instance, the crew on the now lost ship that used to be in the Berlin Museum, and so on. So there seems to be a wider spectrum, and it's a pity that Julia had to leave just now, because it really reminded me of the graffiti that you add to a person in a two-dimensional representation that perhaps was always a picture of that person, or perhaps it's sort of a specification that, hey, now this is me. Perhaps that was what the artist had in mind all along, or perhaps it's a reinterpretation, and this seems to be a similar. So that's sort of a gray area, I think, between individuality and anonymity. And I think probably the best way to get a grasp of that is to think in terms of roles and functions. So you have a depiction of someone butchering cattle for the mortuary cult, and you also ideally have someone actually butchering cattle for the mortuary cult that you can present at the festivals. So ipso facto, that model becomes a depiction in one sense or another of the persons fulfilling those functions. And just a quick note on another similar sort of difference in affordances, where we also have since we have the spatial arrangement of the coffin, you can do things there that you can't do with three-dimensional objects. So most obviously in the purification ritual that Hauke Willems has studied, where you have the sieve at one end and you have the Ankh signs at the other, at the foot end. So they kind of go together in a way that you could do with three-dimensional objects, but it's a bit more cumbersome with the kind of materiality that you have of those objects. So again, what one modality allows you to do one thing and another to do another.
Carlos?
I totally agree with the difference that the difference in materiality can be exploited in different ways. I was thinking precisely at when Lisa said that headrest has the name of the owner of the coffin on it. If that could be parallel with the change in the redaction of the text from the first person to the third. So you think that the headrest is more like a signature of the owner, that the headrest belongs to me, or is kind of because we have a coffin text spell for the headrest, so it's like putting in the third person the headrest as if we. A kind of very syncretic way to put it, or you see what I mean? Or is the signature of property of the object?
So this is something what I think it's very hard to answer, because as I said, I think on the first day there are these different possibilities, and so why just one possible answer? I could also imagine that you can have, so you have this is what you have, so the name on the headrest, but connected with this can be different possibilities, or this can have different reason, and maybe it's by purpose that you have these different levels. So maybe you or the Egyptians had it in mind that there are different answers or reasons exactly for that. So from my point of view, we do not have to decide, is it because of this or because of that? It could also be because of both. And this is combined, and the result is the name on the headrest. And the reason for that can be both.
Thank you, Gersand, and then Jorke.
Yeah, sorry, my computer is always switching off and on. I'm sorry. I can disappear in any moment. Yeah, so Yeah, concerning the inscription on the address, I had this question on the inscription of that you identify on the different objects you studied. Is the inscription always written on an object of the highest quality in the funerary burial equipment? Because it can be something that, I don't know if the address, I don't remember if is in cedar or coniferous wood. It can be also a mark of prestige also to have name on this object. But if you have also object of less quality on different materials that are written, so it means that it's something else, or it can be both. So yes, I totally agree with you. We can't choose, we can't decide, but we have to highlight all these variations, as you say.
Okay, Jorge?
Yeah, I technically misclicked, but I do have a small addition that I would like to make, but more on the highly unlikely, but who knows, side of things. It could also theoretically be the case that headrests are made in that there were multiple headrests in the shop, and they had to mark it somehow that this one was for this specific owner. I find it highly unlikely, to be honest, but it's one of those cases that it's always good to always remember humanity and basic human actions in these kinds of things as well. So don't automatically switch towards more religious matters, but also keep bare bones basic humanity into regard as well. But I find your suggestions more likely, mind you.
Elisabeth?
Yeah, just to add something to what Gerland said before, because as you said, sometimes you have the name on a headrest that has not such a high quality, but so what does we do with that now? But then, for example, we have to keep in mind that there might also be other reasons why now we have this headrest with less quality. For example, the tomb owner died suddenly, and so this was in such a moment the only thing that was accessible for the person. So this could also be a reason why we have different levels of quality at some point. But sometimes, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, but also in the tomb of Mentuhotep, there's a King Mentuhotep, he has different levels of quality in the wooden models in his tomb. So this does not automatically has to mean that this is a tomb of low status. It's just the possibility to have different, to have access to different workshops, for example. And so speaking of quality is also always a question. So how do we define quality, or what could be a reason for how or high quality or low quality?
Yeah, absolutely. But this difference of quality inside the same tomb for the same kind of object is existing since the beginning. In the tomb of the nomarch near Pepikem, we have the same. We have exactly the same thing. We have two different qualities. The thing is that they use exactly the same thematics that are typical from the Memphite area, typical of the end of the Old Kingdom. So it's clearly an access to two type of to quality of craftsmen, but then it's the same in the tomb of Narti. You have two type of qualities, but then we have all this question that I think if we don't have a machine to go back in time, we will never know, is how this object were bought only by the owner, or can we think about some gift, or can we, as we do, we bring the kind of, some will bring nice flowers, other will bring things that you can access. But this is, we don't have any, for the models, we don't have any mention of the access to the, how we buy this object. They don't have name. In Egypt, it's crazy. It means that it doesn't exist as a real thing. But that's why it's a kind of, I always think about, speak about support of a need, support of something you need. it's not a real object, but something, and maybe this headrest, inscribed headrest of lower quality we speak about is also something that it's in the tomb, it's present in the tomb, it doesn't have to be beautiful, it's there. We need a headrest, it's there. So.
Dina?
Yeah, I just was constantly thinking when listening to this discussion about the context of TT8, Han married. I know it's a bit later, like New Kingdom, but where you have this situation that Mary died earlier than Ha, and many objects have name inscriptions like attributed to her and to him, because he was buried later, like in a secondary way. So objects like furniture, textiles bear his name or her name. So it's also, let's say, a more pragmatical thing when the burial was happening, and these two steps to designate what belongs to whom. So perhaps we also, to pick up what Jorke just said before, so perhaps we also have to think a bit more in pragmatical ways of organization, like what comes to the tomb. Because some pieces might be from daily use, some pieces have been, like as the models for sure, have been prepared for the funeral, for the rituals there. So.
Oh, no.
There we go. On that note, I think we have a tendency in Egyptology, because of those obviously very elaborate funerary preparations, and you would have to start building your tomb well ahead of time and all that. We have a tendency to forget the sort of standard archaeological adage that the dead do not bury themselves. So we always automatically go to that sort of idea that oh, this is exactly what the tomb owner wanted. This is what he bought for himself. He picked out this piece, or he commissioned this piece exactly the way he wanted it. But actually, I think it's useful to think along the lines that Gerson suggested, that people are bringing these things, and that could account for the difference in quality, and just completely conjecturally, but perhaps it could also account for the fact that some of those models are inscribed, that you want a model statuette of yourself doing something for the deceased in the cult as a kind of pledge for your participation in the cult, or something along those lines. So we're thinking more about that sort of social embeddedness rather than sort of grave goods that are meant for a purely transcendental purpose to come to life in the beyond and so on.
And linked to that what we see as a sort of aggregate, a certain moment in time and what has accumulated until then, rather than a fully coherent intentional image necessarily. Which brings back what I believe were two recurrent themes in the afternoon, really. The first one is that the issue of individual agency, which can extend all the way to emotions. And the other one, that there's a lot of circumstantiality, if I might put it this way. So I don't know if someone wants to follow up on these points, which were present also in the language papers very strongly, I think. With also perhaps the broader thing that's, speaking of variation, we tend to look at patterns, because that is how we tend to gather the data to begin with, and also what is phenomenologically maybe most accessible. But these patterns, to an extent, they are artifacts, by which I mean they are secondary products of something else that is much more elusive. And an illustration was Jorke's paper at the beginning, when he said, okay, this issue of dialects, I'm extending the notion and defining it at the level to include scribal traditions, scribal schools, which is of course an extension, but that is how the thing presents itself to us phenomenologically. So I think these are general issues. Perhaps someone wants to comment on these. Yes, Victoria.
Yes, so that was something that, as you said, kept coming up in the papers, not only linguistically, but even the artistic papers as well, how we try to be looking at patterns to explain variation. And then it seems that most of the times that we did so, we failed to actually find those, especially when we were looking at specific social groups that produce certain things, right? And when we start to give a bit more of agency to the individual, then things perhaps make a bit more of sense. And connecting again with the issue of the headdress and quality, which was also previously discussed. I also, well, this was also brought up before, but I wonder also to which extent we are able to assess what quality means, because it's also a circular question most of the times in Egyptology, because we tend to connect quality with our own notions of prestige, right, or social context. And what do we really know about social context? Because if one thing determines the other, then the problem becomes circular. And that was something that I was also an issue that I was running into with my own research when I was trying to find patterns of language belonging to specific social contexts. So this is something that I wanted to consider as well. Not only the individual, but sometimes I also wonder up to which extent also specific groups, but smaller groups, family, for example, household, also come into play here too. And this also connects with the fact that we sometimes have problems also finding geographical similarities and differences, although we found some of those, but those are also problematic. And if we are speaking about households or families, up to which extent we can have like a family extending also across different geographical periods, but sharing some cultural notions and concepts, and how this all relates to the specific preferences for certain groups to choose some objects in their burial or to use language features. So this is just a general thoughts and general questions, but if anybody wants to weigh in.
Perhaps Jorge, you.
Yeah, I'm I can less time in on your specifics, Victoria, sadly, but that's also simply due to the type of material that we're dealing with. So because it's also good to remember that coffin texts are for the elite of the elites, very small subsection of population, and can therefore not really be used for any social standing or whatever. So it's rather difficult with that one. And another point that I did want to make in general about variation, looking for patterns and everything, which is indeed has its issues. It's also that what I noticed for myself, at least, and this is really disappointing for most people when I have to explain this, but currently my work is mostly based on the existence of variations rather than the attempts to explain them, because I feel that we sometimes get carried away with the idea that we need to explain the variations. And I believe rather that we should first actually just note down the variations that occur in general before we start to look for explanations for them. Yeah, that's an extreme amount of work, sadly, but it also builds in some safety on our side on a scholarly level that we can at least support certain aspects. It is a lot less interesting. I'm completely aware of that, but it's one of those cases that sometimes people start to run away with details that are simply or born from a modern Egyptological error, a small misinterpretation or something, and it has the tendency to run away much quicker than you expect. So it's one of those things that I prefer to go for a bit of caution. And to be honest, I had so much difficulty with actually trying to explain most of the variations that I've come across so far in my work, that I decided that it was a lot safer not to go into that, to the utter disdain of my jury, by the way.
As in, perhaps one should say, even though it is like what the French would call breaking open an already open door, and namely that variation is part of the integral definition of any object that is alive and capable of changing. And so I don't even want to go into a comparison with population genetics and so forth, but it is not something special. I mean, it is part of what makes your object perhaps culturally transmissible to begin with. But these are very general considerations. So perhaps someone wants to go back with something more precise. Victoria, you still have a hand raised, or is that just a remnant? No, it is significant. That's
I just wanted to respond very quick to your case comments before. But first of all, to say that I don't think it's boring at all to study variation just to understand and just to describe what we are seeing. I think it's actually very important. But I also think it's important to at least ask ourselves why variation can be occurring. Also because that's something that has been done in Egyptology always, and not always taking into consideration all the factors. And as you said also briefly in your paper, you are trying to just to assume that everything that you find in the coffin text is actually correct, that there are no mistakes. And this is something that happens a lot in Egyptology. Whenever we see variation, say, okay, this is a mistake. And we assume that we understand the ancient Egyptian language better than the ancient Egyptians themselves, which is very wrong. So I think it's important also to try to understand, to ask ourselves these questions. So just to explain that's just to find an alternative explanation to the usual diachrony, geography, or mistake answers that are usually given. And I wanted to say something else, but I don't remember right now, but maybe it will come up later. So.
But I think there's also this idea that variation, it's not boring at all, of course, but it is something that is just so basically grounded in human practice. I give you an example that is off topic, but it's still Egyptian at about the right centuries. I think if you take the shipwreck sailor, the first time he tells his story, it's ni eat ef ni chepertef. The second one, it's ni eat nothing ni chepertef. It's the same text. Why is there a variation? Well, because it's just human to change it a little bit. It's full of, the text is full of lexical pairs. The first time the lexical pair occurs, it is A-B. The second time, it is almost always inverted B-A. Or it is in the same verse. And the second time it occurs, the two words that make up the pair are distributed over two verses and so forth. So there's a lot of variation just because that's what humans naturally do. So that is also something that exists, I think. And it is absolutely not my intention to dilute all the very tough and rigorous analysis that we have heard over 3 days, but just to add this additional component. Victoria.
Yeah, sorry, I remember what I wanted to say before also, that variation sometimes lead also to change, to diachronical change. And that is something that I liked about your paper as well, Jyrki, that you mentioned when you're studying the variation between the qui and ki ending, and you don't assume that this is a phonological change, that this is just a matter of writing. And that's also something that I consider, that I think is very important to consider as well, how actually the literary practices and scribal schools can be driving this change. And it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily go along with really oral practices, but it's actually just a matter of literary creativity.
Jokke, maybe you want to respond to that or elaborate?
Well, just thank you, mostly. I have to say that it's further than I would personally be willing to go with my data, but it's more, that's just more of a sense of trying to be secure in what I say, what I can say, because if you read the paper, you will notice that I say more today than I actually prescribe in the paper, just because I can't support it strongly enough to make a real statement. But yes, it's indeed that part, because that's the only part we can see, of course. So that's the whole problem. But I do still believe at the same time that even what we're tracking is not through dialect, but rather the scribal schools. I would still say that, assuming that the people in the scribal schools are relatively local, then it's still highly likely that structural how you structure a certain phrase will still be influenced by the local way of speaking, because I have found, thanks to Christian Casey, who gave me a few English statements from Texas, for example, which shows that there is grammatical shift that is not tonal, and that is localized to a specific region as well. So there are cases where just the phrase structure changes, even though there's no other true tonal issues. And that's because that was one of the reasons I was also on the level of we should really start bending the idea of dialect to some extent. Although we need to, as you pointed out very clearly, we need to understand the limitations and the restrictions of what we're dealing with.
Yannick?
Yeah, just another question to Jorge. You consider different factors which might play a role for your different variations of the ending. And I just want to ask if you also considered the nearer phonetic context, which may play a role, like Sandy. I think Jürgen Zeitler has proposed for this ending, in some cases, a Sandy, where the E should be dropped when another E comes after this.
Thank you. I will have to look over my data again. This is something I need to add to look at because I did not do that. But based on my general memory, there is no barely such a thing occurring, because but there are some that do occur, and that's where you get really into the issue of, okay, which J belongs to which word. But they are rarer to my, as far as we're counted. But thank you. I will take a close look at this again.
Andreas, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Carlos, Victoria, I give you a word just in a second. I'm just abusing my privilege and making a remark of my own. If I take one piece of your descriptive results, Jorge, that in the north, in Sakara Licht, they don't have the seated man or the organic classifiers. Now, if we imagine ourselves going there and asking the people, what's this? And they might perhaps just answer, this is how we are doing it. And if you go 500 kilometers to the south, they do it differently, and they will also answer, this is just how we are doing it. So what I mean by that is one question that has been somewhat implicit, somewhat explicit this afternoon is, okay, there's our description of variation, but what would their perception, what would the ancient actors' perception of variation have been? And so, for example, Victoria, you had these labels, archaism and innovations, which is perfectly clear. They're ethic, descriptive labels that describe something. They're not meant to be emic, and they're sort of stepping stones that allow you to get in a second step to something that is perhaps emic. There's no problem at all with the labels per se, but we are probably agreed that no ancient actor would have understood anything in terms of archaism or innovation. They would have a entirely different perception of variation, and trivially, we can say that they would have had one, because that is just part of the definition of register competence, as has been recalled by Dina and present throughout. So that was a general question or theme that I wanted to ask. What can we say or not say about ancient actors' perspectives on the phenomenon that we're dealing with? Who perhaps wants to say something?
Well, at least in my case, I can basically say I can say nothing about this.
Yes.
It's the whole problem that we're also dealing here with mortuary culture. All the statements I've made for the regions have to be with the caveat for coffin text specifically only. The second you move into the frieze descriptions, my statements no longer apply already, because I did not look at that. So I think that, for example, the lack of the humanoid there is more of the whole idea of dangerous scripts related rather than anything else. But even that, I can't say more certainly than that, because I might have needed to state the caveat of this is for a very specific subsect, and only when start to compare it to different lemmas from the same periods can you say a little bit more certainty if I have a point or not. So that might be something else.
Okay, Victoria.
I believe Carlos had a raised hand from before. I don't know if he wants to. No, okay. So what I want to say, it's just an idea, just a thought, and it may even be a bit crazy. But is there a chance that these objects and even the coffins at some point had an audience? that could have impacted also the way these are represented. And I think also in terms of, for example, I believe Jörg was saying also that there is a correlation between the presence of determinatives and the coffins of, I believe it was Bersha. Like Bersha had more determinatives, right? So I was thinking Bersha also more decorated coffins. So can there be a correlation between these things, and can this have something to do also with with an audience? I know they are meant to be in the tomb, but I don't know if at some point they also were supposed to be seen, and by whom.
Okay, perhaps first Carlos and then Gerson, who might be answering this last question.
In fact, I was thinking of another thing that struck my attention in Jörg's talk, is the presence of A40. Usually A40, so the God determinative, is only used for nouns, which is a very interesting thing. So in the coffin text, you have the A1 for the first person, and you have the A50, of course, which you have shown in the data from Barsha, to express that there is a kind of ontological change, possibly, no? But you don't have the God usually. So you have the God with nouns, with entities, no use for a verbal ending or a suffix. So maybe it's a mistake. You only show maybe a couple of examples of that. I don't remember what.
It's in the. I have to look up. I don't know by heart which Delberg.
Yeah, of course.
Was.
Yeah.
So it's not Delberg. So it's a Mer. It's a Merkov.
Okay.
And this Merkov in the entire text, every time you refer to the owner, it's nearly always A40, unless they forgot to add an ending and they did not have the space to actually write out the entire sign. But okay. It's structurally A40 in the entire coffin. But it's one of those cases with Mer that Mer is off the board unique in my book, at least.
Yeah, it is. I found it quite an exception. Yeah, thank you.
Gerson.
Yeah, thank you. So to answer to Victoria about an eventual visibility of the coffin, we have this, I had this thought about the statues, for example, in Asyut mainly, the big statues of the governor of the necropolis, because when I studied them, that will be published inshallah soon, the base of the statues have holes on every angle that can be something to add some elements to make a procession of these statues. And so these big statues, of course, could be some elements visible to the population. And Williams identify like this kind of procession acts to the necropolis also. We don't have the statue, we have this, of course, the Teotihuacan and everything, but for the wood stuff, it's something that we can have in mind. And for the coffins, the problem that I see is that the one that you speak about the beautiful decoration in Bersha are the inner coffins. So they were where they already put in the outer coffins or were invisible during the procession. Is there a procession, a clear procession where people go to see passing the funerary burial equipment, or these different pieces are separated and then make an assembly in the moment of the object are put in the tomb? It's a big question, but I think it's Karakuni who speak about the visible things in the New Kingdom for the coffins, the cost of death and what was visible or not. I can't put the same conclusion on the coffins, but the thing is that of the Middle Kingdom, we don't have some. It's a lot of issue we have to think about. And just to answer to Jörg about what you seem to highlight on the very specific kind of formulas in Mer. the thing is that for the study of the wooden models, Mer is the place to be. And when you compare the production of the models with the coffins, you realize that it's possible that Mer was an official relay, a place, I don't like to say state workshop because we don't have any information about that, and so it's too much to say that. But it's a place where the best craftsmen were working, and they were sending their production out of this area. Even the models that we find, it's the only production that we found some models outside from Mer necropolis. In Acoris, in other places, that it seems that some models from Mer were ordered in this workshop. The thing is that we have the model in the necropolis, but where was the workshop? It's the other point. And the same thing is that the study of the coffins that we made in Kubet El Hawa, so in Aswan, can show that some of them, the most beautiful one, the cedar one, were probably made in Mer. So like an order from the governor from Aswan to the Mer workshop with specific a group of coffins arriving in Aswan to be used by the family of the governor in Kubet El Hawa. And it's very interesting to see how they were used. So you have this order coming from, I think, Mer, but then they are used differently because the one prepared for a woman without the name, so was used by a man. And it's another thing for the one prepared for a man was used by a lady. So you have like something very special in Mer and Der El Bersha. Most of the principle during all the Middle Kingdom, but at the end of this period, the production of models, it's only in Bersha that you will have this development that seems totally linked to the development of the formulas. And the question, when you look at the coffins, you compare the style of the coffins, but the craft, the techniques of construction also. The question is, was it just one workshop where they were working together? You have some elements that are very close. You were speaking also, York, of so many variation in Mer. Every coffin has its own variation. And yeah, it seems that this place was very important place for the access of some kind of wood also that is all that can be only made by an official seal. The quantity of cedar is amazing in this place. And so maybe there were so many painters, more scribes. It can be something that, I don't know, I can explain something else.
And Dina?
Yeah, I would like to pick up this idea of visibility. To whom were the objects and all the equipment, the text visible, and also to pick up some of the thoughts which we just heard. I was thinking that probably texts and objects were visible in several stages of the preparation and the burial. So first in the workshop, right? So if we imagine workshops as collective working places where a lot of people collaborate, they would encounter and have kind of an access more or less restricted, but they would have an access to these objects and to the partly also to the concepts connected to them. Then I would imagine we would have also the relatives. So even after the owner has died, in case he or she did not have the time to check whether everything is correct or has been elaborated correctly, I could imagine that it's the relatives, the kin, who would check whether, like, what's going on. Is the burial equipment correct? Because it's also a matter of financing. Or let's say, I would just say financing, the cost of death, because it's not always the deceased who is, as we know, who pays for it, but also like the relatives. So I could imagine pragmatically that they would have a look whether everything is intact and has been inscribed in the proper way. And then, as has been said before, the procession. And as a fourth step, yeah, some of the objects are made for the deceased, right? So if we go with this and imagine that he or she is living in the tomb, in the grave, in the coffin, and so all these things are to be read by the deceased. So kind of we would have a complex communication system, kind of, right? Because we have very different addresses, many instances having access to this on a more or less, yeah, detailed manner or not. Yeah.
I think it's a good model, and it combines two points of view. First three stages is according to the saying, the burial are not for the dead but for the living, basically. Has been quoted by René van Velzen, for example. And the last one is this general principle of attribution of agency, which we do all the time. We attribute agency to animals, to stones, and so forth. But my role is not to speak, so I give the word to Elisabeth.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to add another step to what Dina said before, because when everything is in the burial and maybe the object do what they have to do for the dead people, this is not the last step, because before this there might be rituals performed, and also during this, because we have also archaeological evidence for rituals. And for example, in the tomb of Jehuti Nacht, where the objects are placed at specific parts of or beside specific parts of the coffin, this might have been the same in different contexts. So for example, the offering ritual, and also texts that have been performed or used during this offering ritual, this might have been done in front of the coffin, so on the east side of the coffin. And also then people were present, so maybe not all of the people that accompanied the procession, but nevertheless there were people, priests, that were there when this ritual were performed. And also then what happens inside the coffin does not stay inside the coffin, because these rituals that are permanent inside the coffin were also performed during the funeral in one or the other way. So not all the rituals inside the coffin were also performed in that way, but maybe parts of this ritual also were performed during the funeral. And so this might also have been visible for some of the people, for some audience.
And if I might add, might seem self-evident, but all of this leaves, of course, a collective memory. So it extends in time well beyond the rituals and the burial itself. And there's also a social extension, because people who have been present, who have been attendees, they might talk to other people. And so there are all these extensions. But we had a raised hand by Seria.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, the video doesn't work. Oh, wait. Sorry, the connection is not good today. But I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but and sorry for the last minute question, but I have a very different question to Elizabeth. And first of all, thank you for your fascinating paper. I totally agree with the concept of functional substitution and the idea of grave goods and the coffin acting together to realize the funeral ritual. Related to this, I have a question about the differences with burial without the object frieze. Because in the early Middle Kingdom, the object frieze was painted on many coffins, but there were also coffins without the object frieze, even in the same cemetery. For example, in Teti Pyramid Cemetery, there were some early Middle Kingdom tombs from which burial goods, like you have shown us today, were found, but not all of them had the coffin with the object frieze. So what do you think about this difference? Is it possible that some burials focused on painting the object on the coffin? On the other hand, other burials focused on writing a text on the coffin instead of the object frieze?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And so my first impression is just to say it's sad for the tomb owner that he or she has no object freeze. But I also think in this case, it might have different reasons. And I think you have to look in detail what might be the reason for that. For example, in my dissertation, I worked with some intact burials also from Abusir. And in this case, for example, there's one intact burial in which 4 different individuals have been buried. And in this case, I think the question why these people had no object freeze is just because the lower status of the tomb owner. So I think in this case, for example, it's also a question of money. So it might be it might have been expensive to have a coffin with all the different decorations. And so I think one possible reason for that is that the tomb owner did not have enough money to buy a coffin with such a decoration. But nevertheless, in this case, this does not mean that that the rituals did not have taken place. In this case also, you have the burial equipment that could have maybe substituted things like that are connected to special rituals that were performed during the funeral. Another reason, as I have proposed, might also be the time of death. So in some cases, maybe the person died suddenly, and then maybe just another coffin or a coffin without an object freeze might have been accessible for him. So I think you have to look in the special cases and then find answers. And I think there might not be a general answer to this, but I think, yeah, one reason might be the status of the tomb owner. The other might be the time of death, availability of money. But yeah, in the end, also these people were buried, and funeral and burial rituals have taken place. So I think not having an object freeze does not mean that these special rituals did not have been performed. It's just another way how these rituals were expressed. So not in a written or in a pictorial way, then maybe in the way of objects or the funeral equipment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think so too. There are many reasons. Yeah, thank you so much.
And so it's time to wrap it up. So first, let me thank all the participants of this afternoon's session, including the discussants. And I will now give the word back to Carlos, who has something to say. But before that, let us all warmly thank Carlos for having put together this beautiful and extremely rich conference. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you all. I would like to take advantage of the occasion to present something to you, to make an announcement. Can you see my screen now? Okay. So this I want to present to you the MORTEXVAR database, one of the main outcomes of the project too. This database manages data I have been extracting from the ancient Egyptian coffin text, mainly from the edition by the book since 1999 now, to digitize them, analyze them, and make them universally accessible. The technical part of the project has been made possible by the collaboration with Anthony Contreras, a member of the MORTEXVAR project, an IT developer, alumnus of the University of Alcalá. For 2 years now, we have been working on the database to find a way to organize the material available in the reference edition of this text by Ada in the book, and the information in the index of spells by Leonard Lesko, in order to reduce, or to try to reduce, the entropy inherent to this text from our point of view, and to present data in a meaningful and useful way to our modern eye. To work with the book's edition, we have the support of the Oriental Institute, the University of Chicago, as we have their permission to work with the 8th volume that was published by Jim Allen with pyramid text copies on Middle Kingdom materials. The MORTEXVAR database covers all the 1,185 coffin text spells. Note that in its current state, the database only covers the version of the main witness. So to say, the main witness for each spell. The main witness uses to be the first one on the left in the book's edition, which is not always the best one, but it uses to be. A central tool for the MORTEXVAR project, this platform allows us to store text in a relational database so that we may carry out complex searches in a way which is useful and intuitive for any user. The data model allows us to break down and translate the text into different languages, only in French by now, by comparing them with their transliteration. In addition to this, the platform permits to visualize the information from 4 points of view: the spells, it should work, yeah. The texts by paragraph, it means following the paragraph as in the book's edition. The witnesses, here we have archaeological information about the documents and the witnesses, necropolis, chronology. All the searches can be downloaded, so you can have this in a Excel format, and the positions of the spells within the coffins. So we have here the spells by number, and then the different parts of the coffins, head, foot, back, and so on, and the specific documents in which the spells appear. The project architecture comprises two systems: one backend made with Django REST framework in Python, and its frontend made with Vue.js JavaScript. It also has an administration system that permits the management of the database's internal data without requiring technical knowledge. The data is stored in two databases, initially a MySQL database. If a more significant data load is necessary, a system with Elasticsearch has been implemented too. For the future, we plan to expand on the database. We have recently had funding for a first expansion of the database from October, and for 1 year. We'll be linking the database with the book's PDFs, so to provide the user with a view of the hieroglyphic transcription by the book and our transliteration and translation. Only always the main witness yet by now. The two obvious prospective expansions are: one, to enter the transliteration and translation of all the witnesses, not only the main one, but all the witnesses. And two, to enter all the material of the pyramid text, for which we have already Jim Allen's permission to use his database on the pyramid text. This is a very, as you see, a very ambitious project, which makes the coffin text available for everyone. And this is why I take this opportunity here to give a call for collaboration at any level, personal or institutional, on research or fundraising. If some of you or someone you know are interested in collaborating, just please email us. And that's all about the database. I would like to thank you very much. Stop sharing now. I would like to thank you very much, all of you, the speakers, for your wonderful contributions. I would like also to thank the audience for being there. I don't know, I forgot, Ernesto, if we have some questions from the audience.
No questions, but
okay.
lot of nice messages, so I can after share that with you.
Okay, so you can go if you want to share them now, or is,
I can copy and after I share it by the chat if it's okay.
okay. So thank you very much to you all for your time and your contributions. I don't know if you want to add something. You are fine with everything. Okay, so we can close the conference, I think. Andreas, if you agree, and thanks a lot for everything. Yeah,
Thanks to you.
thank you for the interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.